What if the future of humanity is not living on other worlds, but learning how to build better ones? The dream of space colonization usually begins with planets. Mars, the Moon, Venus, maybe Titan if you're feeling ambitious and have a very warm coat. Planets are where civilization began, but they may not be where most civilizations live. Planets are big, heavy, awkward gravity wells, wrapped in weather, geology, politics, and whatever local inconveniences nature feels like leaving there. Space habitats let us do something very different. Instead of moving to worlds we find, we build the worlds we want. Mobile worlds that can move if you and your neighbors or former countrymen no longer see eye to eye. Most space habitats are not ideally laid out to be spaceships, but slap on an engine or hire a tug and then go anywhere. Indeed, that's the entire idea of an interstellar arc ship or generation ship. And that raises a simple question with a very complicated answer. What counts as a space habitat? Recently we discussed the von Braun wheel, one of the first serious space station designs moving toward the idea of people living comfortably in space for long periods without health problems of microgravity. But I don't really consider the von Braun wheel a full space habitat. It is more of a station, a place for crews. A true habitat is something more ambitious. A place for families, communities, ecosystems, industries, and eventually whole civilizations. That got me thinking that over the years we have covered a lot of habitat designs, but usually one at a time, or really fast entries as in our Megastructure compendium. We've also mentioned several that, opting because of limited graphics or time, never got their own full episode, but still deserve more than a quick name drop. So today we are doing what we have done with some of our other anthology episodes, gathering older material, revising it, trimming out redundant material or non-episode material, adding new segments, and taking a grand tour through the architecture of artificial worlds. We will begin with a new one for us, the Sunflower, one of Gerard K. O'Neill's early habitat concepts, before moving to the classic O'Neill Cylinder, the great island in the sky, that still defines much of space settlement thinking. From there we will look at Lewis 1, a practical industrial habitat design from the 1990s, then the Stanford Torus, Kalpana 1 and 2, and the Bernal Sphere, three very different answers to the question of how we make a rotating community in space. Then we scale up. We look at the Bishop Ring, where a habitat begins to be bigger than many nations, and the Topopolis, where a cylinder world can stretch on for endless miles. We look at McKendree Cylinders, graphene-class cousins of the O'Neill Cylinder, large enough to hold countries or continents, then come back down to the practical with hammer habs, bolo habitats, and other early spin gravity systems for ships and small crews. We will also look at Rungworlds, linked chains of habitats that grow like ladders into artificial nations, before finishing with Conglomerations, the great clustered archipelagos of habitats that may be how most space civilizations actually live. Needless to say, we will not cover every possible design. If we tried, this episode would become less a compendium and more an orbital sentence without parole. Indeed, I already broke the episode into two so we could cover the more over-the-top options like ringworlds and cube or donut-shaped planets in their own anthology after this. I gather if we hadn't split them, we'd have run into YouTube's maximum length limit. But we are going to cover the main families, the important trade-offs, and the recurring questions. How much gravity, shielding, land, water, nature, industry, and sheer scale do you need before a station becomes a world? And as we go, think about which of these you would actually want to live in. A compact Stanford Torus town, a vast O'Neill Cylinder with forests curving overhead, a practical Lewis 1 industrial settlement and asteroid, a continent-sized Bishop Ring, a Topopolis river world, something else entirely that we missed. Let me know in the comments which habitat you'd most like to see get its own full episode, or which one you think would be most common in a mature space civilization. And if you enjoy these deep dives in the future of civilization, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. Then grab a drink and a snack, settle in, and let's begin our tour of the megastructures we may one day call home. The Sunflower. The first stop on the tour is the Sunflower, which is both a space habitat design and a reminder the future often begins a sketch that looks slightly ridiculous until enough engineers stare at it. The Sunflower was one of Gerard K. O'Neill's early habitat concepts, predating the designs he's best known for, and seemed a good place to begin our journey today. Not just chronologically either, as in many ways it sits between the von Braun wheel and the later island designs. The von Braun wheel is essentially a rotating station, a place people could live and work in space for long periods without losing bone and muscle mass to microgravity, but it's still more station than rolled. We did an episode on it recently, and writing that encouraged me to put together today's anthology of other major space habitats and several lesser-known ones, like the Sunflower, that we really haven't had a chance to cover. I tend to view the von Braun station as not being a habitat because there's no place in it for long-term habitation with families and ecosystems in mind. And the line between space station and space habitat is blurry, but I feel it needs to be heading in that direction to qualify as a habitat. The Sunflower, then, is where we begin shifting from space station to space settlement, and maybe even space habitat. It's not just a ring of cabins and laboratories, it's a deliberate attempt to make a pleasant, livable, semi-natural home in orbit, with light, gardens, community space, and something like a horizon, even if that horizon curves upward rather quickly. The basic idea is a stubby rotating cylinder, roughly 1,500 feet across or 460 meters, meant to hold around 10,000 people. That makes it much smaller than Island 3, the classic O'Neill cylinder we'll discuss next, but still vastly larger than anything humans have ever built in space. Unsurprisingly, the Sunflower's name does not come from its cylinder. It comes from the mirrors, and from the recognition that the space habitat needs to bounce sunlight inward, rather than simply let the sun rise and set naturally. Earth spins once every 24 hours, but most space habitats, with the exception of something enormous like a Banks orbital, spin at very different rates. For the kind of habitats we are discussing today, built from mundane materials and meant to provide spin gravity, that rotation rate is generally measured in minutes. Indeed, critical to most of these designs is keeping the rotation rate down to once or twice per minute or less, and even then, having the sun rise and set every minute or so would not be comfortable. So if we do have glass or transparent panels for light to enter through, we usually want to bounce that light off mirrors first, aiming it in a way that produces steady illumination. Then we can move those mirrors to dim, redirect, or shut off the light when we want dusk, dawn, or nighttime conditions. And while it was not part of this early design, we can also imagine coating those mirrors so they only reflect certain wavelengths, cutting down dangerous ultraviolet light, or filtering out more blue light to give us a warmer red dawn or dusk illumination. I'm sure that thought did not originate with me, but I did think it up independently, and it was from thinking of those outer mirrors as petals and imagining red, orange, and yellow flower petals. Speaking of which, around the habitat are these petal-like reflective structures, arranged to catch sunlight and directed into the interior, and we see this in the better-known Island 3 design. It's a good design concept, takes two things space gives us an edge on and utilizes them. First, the abundance of free sunlight, and second, a weightless and airless environment in which it becomes cheap to build and maintain ultra-thin metal mirrors of enormous scope, and arrange the geometry of the habitat around it. Earth receives only a tiny fraction of the sun's output, while space habitats can place mirrors, collectors, and radiators wherever geometry and orbital mechanics allow. That changes the whole logic of the architecture. On Earth, buildings fight weather and gravity. In space, they fight radiation, heat, spin stress, and the problem of getting sunlight wherever you want it, without also inviting every dangerous thing that travels with them. As an earlier design, we don't get the same number of images of it we get with some of the others. Not that they are numerous either. Even now, good visualizations of rotating habitat interiors are rarer than you might expect. In those few representations, we usually see two main living or working zones, the central habitat volume, and then a second ring beyond the mirrors. This also follows in later designs where the second one, past the mirrors, is meant for agriculture, and thus way less demanding in terms of shielding and aiming for Earth-like conditions. The Sunflower also shows us why later designs changed. Its smaller diameter means it has to rotate faster to provide Earth-like gravity. This is one of the recurring trade-offs in space habitats, and we will come back to it a lot today. And the Stanford Torus segment is where we will give the clearest and most detailed explanation of spin gravity itself. For now, the short version is the smaller rotating habitat needs a faster spin to produce the same apparent gravity at the rim. Faster spin makes the habitats easier to build smaller, but also increases Coriolis effects, which can make people dizzy or nauseated, and it can create strange effects whenever you throw a ball, pour water, run, jump, or just turn your head too quickly. Some people can probably adapt to surprisingly high spin rates, some may not, and importantly, we are not only designing for healthy adult astronauts, we're designing for children, elderly people, pets, livestock, trees, fish, insects, fungi, and entire ecosystems. That is a major reason the later classic designs grew larger. Bigger is better for space habs and arc ships, for several reasons, but obviously you want the smallest habitat that would do the job because they cost money, terrifyingly huge amounts of money that would make any budgeting officer have a heart attack. One of the reasons is that bigger habitats spin more slowly for the same gravity, in terms of angular rate anyway. They actually move faster in tangential terms, and slow spin is more comfortable for us. But bigger habitats also require more material, more shielding, more construction capacity, and usually a larger population to justify them. The Sunflower is therefore a compromise between the two desires. Make the station small enough to be an early settlement, but large enough to feel like a real place. It also helps illustrate another recurring theme, the difference between habitable volume and a livable world. You can make a structure pressurized and safe without making it pleasant. We have done that many times. A space habitat, properly speaking, is not just a pressure vessel with oxygen in it. It is built as an environment meant to support the rhythms of daily life. The Sunflower leans into that. Its terraces and sunlight are not decorative luxuries, they are part of the argument that space settlement must be psychologically and socially sustainable. A habitat that keeps you alive but makes everyone miserable is not a civilization. It's a slow-motion disaster waiting to unfold. That is a notion I often think of when I ponder my own variation on this design, the parabola habitat concept, meant for use beyond the asteroid belt. It basically replaces the petals with a much larger parabolic dish farther behind the habitat to bounce light inward. I think we might see such modified sunflower settlements deeper out in space where the sun grows dim. In such an environment where the nearest other human settlement or ship might be millions of miles away and minutes of light distant, even in a well-developed solar system, that vital need for Earth-like living spaces, at least semi-self-sufficient ecosystems, starts to become critical even for the most hardened space pioneers. Now, from a modern standpoint, parts of the Sunflower feel both charming and underdeveloped. It belongs to that early era where artists and engineers were feeling their way toward the vocabulary of space settlement. The exact structural details, shielding arrangements, agriculture, maintenance systems, and industrial support are not as deeply developed as later designs. It is more of a bridge concept than a final blueprint. But that is not an insult. Bridges matter. Before you can get the O'Neill Cylinder, Stanford Torus, Bernal Sphere, Kalpana One, Lewis One, and all the other designs we will discuss today, you need someone to ask the obvious but neglected question. What if people in space do not merely survive, but live? And that's where this Sunflower earns its place at the beginning. It's not the biggest design we will discuss. It's technically not the earliest either. The Bernal Sphere's original design is much older. It is not the most efficient, the most famous, or the most practical. It is certainly not the endpoint of space habitat design. But it is a wonderful early attempt to turn orbital settlement into something more human, more terrestrial. It tells us that space habitats are not only engineering problems measured in tons, meters, spin rates, and radiation doses. They are also homes, and homes need light, space, beauty, and a sense that tomorrow is not just another maintenance shift. In a way, the Sunflower is a sketch of the dream before the dream becomes industrialized. Its mirrors open like petals, its interior promises gardens in orbit, and its whole design says the high frontier does not have to be gray corridors and blinking panels. You can have parks, water, sunlight, and communities large enough to have their own customs, politics, gossip, and bad local sports teams. But as beautiful as a Sunflower is, it also points us toward the need for something larger, slower spinning, more efficient in land area, and more capable of becoming a true artificial world. The Sunflower is the seed. The O'Neill Cylinder is what grows from it. For all of human history, land has been the battleground of empires, the fuel for wars, and the foundation of civilizations, with even the tiniest islands being fiercely contested. But what if the next great frontier isn't on Earth, or even other planets, but in vast artificial islands we build, not on the sea, but in the heavens above? Humanity has always looked beyond the horizon, from crossing oceans to conquering the skies. Now our ambitions stretch even further, to the stars themselves, or ad astra in Latin. Space colonization is no longer just the dream of science fiction, but a growing field of serious research, investment, and debate. and in truth, it has been for over half a century, growing from the compelling vision of pioneers like Gerard K. O'Neill. In the 1970s, O'Neill proposed that space habitats might not just serve as way stations between planets, but could become the primary homes for humanity. Today, we will be looking at one of his most famous designs, Island 3, now widely known as the O'Neill Cylinder. Designed to provide a self-sustaining home for millions, the vast rotating space habitats he envisioned offer an alternative to planetary colonization, creating true islands in the sky. I don't think I've mentioned any space habitat design more often in our discussions of the future than the O'Neill Cylinder, of which Island 3 is the best known configuration. It's probably a big reason I was offered the role of President of the National Space Society, an organization whose motto is Ad Astra, and that emerged from the L5 Society, which was dedicated to making O'Neill's vision a reality. And the development and creation of such habitats remains one of our core principles. If you're a channel regular, you probably already knew why, but if not, if you're new here, by the end of this episode, I think you'll see why. And if you are new here, I hope you take a moment to hit those like and subscribe buttons, and grab yourself a drink or a snack, as the O'Neill Cylinder is a large topic, indeed one 20 miles long and 5 wide. I'm now beginning my second term as NSS president, and I've spent much of that time collecting insight from members, many of whom have been thinking about space habitats for over 50 years. Those conversations made me want to revisit this topic because there are so many more applications and possibilities to explore, but the O'Neill Cylinder remains my favorite, and for good reason. As we'll see today, it provides the best optimization of resources to land area, the most living space for the least cost, and the most advantageous layout for human habitation. It allows for interconnected communities, forming entire orbital states. One point I want to make from the outset, one that applies to all space habitats, is how they fundamentally change civilization as we know it. Space habitats completely redefine land ownership, governance, and human expansion. Unlike artificial islands on Earth, which still require extensive real estate, space habitats take very little mass to construct relative to their size, can be designed with any day length, gravity, or climate, and exist in a place where elbow room isn't scarce, outer space. Space habitats are mobile. They are effectively spaceships, albeit not built for rapid travel, and these habitats are often factored into designs for making interstellar journeys as well. But the key difference is this: a single plant's worth of raw materials would create millions of plants' worth of habitats. One modest asteroid, rich in minerals but low on gravity, of the type we have a million of in the asteroid belt, could form its own continent worth of space habitats, whether they are built there and remain or moved to someplace someone wants them. And because they can move, they offer a revolutionary alternative to territorial disputes. If a community wants to separate, it literally can. If a region becomes overcrowded, a new habitat can be built instead of forcing expansion into neighboring lands. Separatist movements don't have to fight for autonomy, they can simply construct their own world elsewhere, or move the one they are on to a friendlier space. This is the promise space habitats offer that planets cannot. Colonizing Mars would be incredible, and with enough effort, it could even be made into a paradise world, just as Venus might one day be transformed into. But planets are few and finite. No matter how much space they offer, once they fill up, growth means conflict, whether it be diplomatic or economic conflict, all the way to outright war. Space habitats can break this cycle. So with that in mind, what exactly is an O'Neill cylinder, and how does it work? The basic function is in the name. An O'Neill cylinder is a large, rotating cylinder in space that contains a pressurized atmosphere. By spinning, it generates artificial gravity through centrifugal force. The amount of gravity depends on the cylinder's diameter and its rotation speed, so inhabitants can have precise control over the environment inside. We've explored spin gravity in depth in previous space habitat episodes, so we won't repeat all the details here. However, this principle imposes the main structural constraint on the habitat. A cylinder can, in theory, be any length, with extreme examples like a Topopolis, a version that could stretch millions or even billions of miles. But the wider the cylinder or the stronger the gravity it generates, the greater the structural stress on its materials. This makes material strength a critical factor in determining how large and practical an O'Neill cylinder can be. All the inner surface of the cylinder's sides serve as the ground. You live inside it, with up pointing toward the central axis of rotation, and down being the interior wall of the cylinder. So in some ways it's the opposite of living on a planet where everyone lives on its surface. At either end, you have caps, which are often depicted as flat in artist renderings, but in reality they would likely be rounded or even hemispherical to better handle structural stress, even though this requires slightly more material. Unlike ring habitats, where much of the structure consists of walls or ceilings, an O'Neill cylinder is designed so that the majority of its surface area is usable land. The ceiling, in this case, isn't a true ceiling, it's simply the landscape on the opposite side of the cylinder. This design effectively makes your neighbor's backyard your sky, rather than just a piece of radiation shielding. And that radiation shielding is a key concept in space habitats, because when we crunch the numbers, we generally find that shielding requires 10 to 100 times more mass than the structure itself. Dirt and water are excellent, cost-effective shields, not just against radiation, but also for protection against micrometeor impacts. So rather than just building a barren shell, it makes sense to incorporate a landscape inside the habitat, effectively using the very ground underfoot as a protective barrier. This approach to radiation shielding is the inverse of a planet, where the sky is our thin shield from solar and cosmic radiation. In an O'Neill cylinder, the ground beneath us serves that role instead. The optimal amount of shielding is debatable, as future generations might have different tolerances. They may be far more cautious than us, or they might have advanced DNA repair and cancer treatments that make lower shielding requirements acceptable. I would guess both, that they repair radiation damage easier, but are less tolerant of having it around. You will also likely use this in tandem with magnetic deflectors and additional layers of shielding made from materials designed to handle certain types of radiation better. For any type of radiation shielding, the principle of halving thickness applies. Each additional layer of shielding has the amount of radiation that gets through. If 1 meter, or about 3 feet of soil, cuts radiation by half, then 2 meters reduces it to 1/4, 3 meters to 1/8, and so on. 5 meters, 16 feet of soil, reduces incoming radiation to a 32nd, about 3% of its original intensity, making the interior environment comparable to Earth's surface. Conveniently, 5 meters of soil also works well for creating natural landscapes inside the habitat. Most trees do not have roots that deep, and for those that do, we could reinforce the soil with strong mesh layers to provide additional anchoring. Moreover, the soil layer does not need to be uniform. Hills, valleys, and even artificial lakes can be sculpted into the terrain. We could even create elevated bubble-like platforms covered in soil for raised landscapes, or push depressions into the floor to accommodate deeper bodies of water. Building the structure out of graphene and filling spaces with aeroshells, both made from the abundant element carbon, are popular ideas, but the original version just called for plain, ordinary steel. I want to emphasize that while we will be talking a lot about the specific Island 3 design, it was intentionally designed using readily available materials and engineering from the 1970s. It was meant to demonstrate that such a habitat could have been built even at the end of the Apollo era, without relying on futuristic materials or advanced technology. Needless to say, we've made significant advancements since then. While I often discussed minor upgrades using better modern steel, aluminum, or even Kevlar, and viewed graphene habitats as a more distant possibility centuries from now, I am now much more optimistic about the near-future mass production of graphene superlaminate, GSL. Because of this, it is quite possible that we will never produce a steel or aluminum-based design at all for large-scale space habitats. The reality is that an O'Neill cylinder is not going to be the first space habitat we build, especially not at Island 3 scale or larger. These habitats are designed for a future where millions of people live and work in space, and to help with overcrowding on Earth, but population growth rates have dropped since the 1960s and 70s, and so I would not expect overcrowding to be an issue on Earth this century. So we're putting people up there because there's work in space that needs doing. Even if we assume that the spacefaring population increases by a factor of 10 every generation, about 25 years, a small-scale Stanford Torus for 10,000 people would likely be built at least 50 years after a more basic von Braun wheel, and at least 50 years before a full-scale O'Neill cylinder. In practice, if you had 1 million people living in space, They wouldn't all be in one O'Neill cylinder. They would be scattered across hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller facilities. Most likely, no more than 10% of the total space-based population would live in the largest single habitat, which would probably function as something like Earth's primary shipyard and spaceport, or the capital of a major nation or alliance. A true Island 3 design, capable of housing and feeding 1 million people, might not be needed until we have at least 10 million people in space, and something even larger would come much later. And this is a key point that needs to be kept in mind. O'Neill cylinders are to space development what skyscrapers are to city development, or what large suburban housing developments are to expanding towns. They are not the starting point of space colonization, but something you build once a place is already well developed. Your typical Martian or lunar dome is more like the space equivalent of a log cabin, a small, early settlement. This is also why we don't spend much time discussing the construction cost of O'Neill cylinders in today's economic terms, because we won't be building one for at least a couple of centuries unless automation advances dramatically. That said, it probably will, and if we reach the point where robots can be sent to asteroids to self-replicate and construct these habitats, then the timeline speeds up considerably. To be honest, at this point, I think if we don't have that technology inside this century, it's probably either because we got it, slipped, and got killed off by AI, or because we banned the technology, in order to prevent getting wiped out by AI, directly or existentially. In theory, we could build an O'Neill cylinder with modern manpower and technology, and space construction offers some major advantages, though it also comes with its challenges. However, actually doing so now would be so impractical that estimating modern costs is about as useful as trying to calculate the price of building a skyscraper in 1825. The basic technology for tall buildings existed back then, but skyscrapers wouldn't emerge for a few generations, when economic conditions and engineering realities had completely changed. An O'Neill cylinder masses several billion tons, so even using the most favorable modern launch costs, constructing one would cost more than the entire global economic output for several years. However, that number drops dramatically once we start sourcing raw materials from space. If a lunar base has a solar or nuclear-powered mass driver, all well within our current technological abilities, it could fling pods of regolith to a construction site for orders of magnitude less cost, where it is then processed into dirt, shielding, and structural plating. At a certain point, the cost of building an O'Neill cylinder will either become cheaper than the cost of buying an equivalent amount of land area on Earth, or simply become too small a cost to be a primary factor. Once productivity and wealth per capita reach high enough levels, a family could purchase an acre or two of land inside a new cylinder and build a home there with a reasonable mortgage. And what qualifies as reasonable to people in the late 22nd century will likely look very different from today, just as our own housing costs today are radically different from those of the past. How much land is it, incidentally? Well, as mentioned, the basic Island 3 design is 20 miles, 32 kilometers long, and 5 miles or 8 kilometers wide. We often pair it up with another 2 for issues having to do with rotation and wobble, but we'll get to that later. Moreover, you often see the design with large glass windows in it to let light in. Not direct sunlight, incidentally. You bounce it off mirrors that keep a steady supply of light as it turns, and which do not reflect harmful radiation, just the wavelengths you want. I do not view this as necessary. Prefer to bounce the light in through an end cap instead, onto a mirror array inside the habitat, but we do have hyper-strong transparent materials these days too. Assuming no space given over to windows or sea, you've got a usable land area inside the O'Neill cylinder that is approximately 503 square miles. That's about half the size of Rhode Island, or 2/3 the land area of my own home county of Asheville, Ohio, which is the largest in the state, and it would take just over 80 of them to match the land area of Ohio, which appropriately has just over 80 counties in total, one cylinder, 503 square miles, or 3 to 22,000 acres, or 14 billion square feet. For the other half of our audience that prefers metric, that's 1,302 square kilometers, 130,200 hectares, or 1,302,000,000 square meters, about half the size of Luxembourg. It would take approximately 100 O'Neill cylinders to match the land area of England, 275 O'Neill cylinders to match Germany, and 290 O'Neill cylinders to match Japan. Needless to say, it helps to have some water in these habitats, not just smaller lakes and rivers. But determining the ideal ratio is challenging. Earth has a roughly 3-to-1 water-to-land ratio, which is likely higher than what we want in an O'Neill cylinder. We'd also want different biomes, including grasslands, large forests, mountains, tundras, and deserts, though not necessarily in the same proportions as on Earth. There is a tendency to depict these structures as mostly land, but I'd argue that coastal environments would be more desirable for residential areas. As we'll get to that in a bit, habitation cylinders are not primarily intended for large-scale food production, nor are they envisioned as isolated standalone facilities. Instead, a nation-state in space might consist of a few hundred O'Neill cylinders tethered together, alongside thousands of smaller facilities dedicated to specialized non-habitation purposes. That's far into the future, perhaps one that will never exist, since humanity may no longer need or desire terrestrial environments by then. We might all live in virtual utopias, exist as immortal cyborgs, or be nothing more than data entries in a vast computer mind that wiped us out. More likely, I suspect the future will see a diverse landscape of humans, AIs, and post-human entities, some of whom will still appreciate natural environments. And that might include the AI too. We shouldn't just assume they will all automatically like everything in steel and glass and not forest and field. Given the sheer abundance of resources in the solar system, let alone the galaxy, I don't anticipate fights to death over how a portion of these resources are used. If a faction obsessed with efficiency views space habitats as wasteful, they wouldn't have much motivation to get violent just because a quarter of the asteroid belt was allocated to building and filling such habitats. I usually estimate O'Neill cylinders as 10 tons per square meter or 1 ton per square foot, a rough approximation that could vary, particularly for dedicated agricultural habitats, which might be lighter. So too, habitats using more water surface area might mass less, as they might decide that since everyone is living on land elevated above sea level, that those spots are the only ones needing maximum radiation shielding, and the beach area would still have a lot too. Regardless, this means a default single O'Neill cylinder would have a mass of about 13 trillion kilograms, 13,000 megatons. Since the asteroid belt has only about 1/2000th of Earth's mass, you could build 250 million O'Neill cylinders just from the asteroid materials, enough to provide 10,000 times Earth's total land area. If you scrapped Earth itself for materials, you could construct enough habitats to provide a living area 4 million times Earth's total surface area, and likely several million times more than our currently usable living space. Again, there are many unanswered questions about land-to-sea ratios and how much land we need for food production, housing, and personal space. However, all of the mass from the asteroid belt contains very little water. There is far more water deeper in space, where potentially millions of oceans worth of ice and volatiles exist in the Kuiper belt and Oort cloud, resources we'll need in bulk for atmospheres and biological systems, or technically Atmos cylinders. For Atmos cylinders, the weather and environmental factors would be vastly different from those on Earth. Unlike a spherical shell of air gravitationally bound to a planet where altitude causes rapid pressure changes, a large pressurized cylinder would experience much less variation in atmospheric pressure. Pressure does vary in large cylinders, but not as sharply, except in massive versions where you might have a thin outer atmosphere or Atmos cylinder. This would be the case for something like the McKendree Cylinder, the larger sibling of an O'Neill cylinder. Rather than a floating island or county, a McKendree Cylinder would be more like an entire continent in space. Our episode Life in an O'Neill Cylinder explores some of the environmental factors in more detail, and we've also covered processing regolith and ice into usable soil in other episodes on space farming and domes, such as the domes of Mars and gardens of the Moon. Now, a habitat this size will need to rotate about once every 2 minutes to produce Earth-like gravity, whereas a habitat with Martian-like gravity would rotate once every 3 minutes, and for lunar gravity it would be closer to 5 minutes. A habitat 4 times as wide would take twice as long to rotate. However, to have a full rotation take an entire day, you would need a structure the size of what we call a Banks orbital, a rotating habitat over 1 million miles across, which also has its own episode from last year. This means we are not trying to dump sunlight into one of these habitats through rotation alone. Instead, We could spin on a different axis once per day to allow sunlight in, but a more practical approach would be to simply leave a window in an end cap and direct light through it using mirrors, adjusting intensity and spectrum as needed. When constructing several hundred square miles of landscape, adding a similarly sized area of tinfoil-thin mirrors is not a significant challenge. Some proposals suggest placing two habitats next to each other and using an array of mirrors to alternately illuminate one and then the other, effectively creating alternating day and night cycles. However, I doubt it would be practical to have different time zones in adjoining habitats. Instead, those mirrors would likely be redirected toward other energy-intensive systems. The emphasis here is on having many movable mirrors, not just a few giant ones. But you might decide it's best to have a community running 24/7 and then alternating day and night might be nice, and then your 12-hour AM/PM setup might be easier than our current time zones. You always know that if it's 2 PM your time, then anyone in the other cylinder is at 2 AM, essentially a mirror habitat to your own. If you only want one time zone for your habitat, then one use for these mirrors could be agricultural cylinders, where lighting and climate could be optimized for specific crops, allowing for productivity far beyond that of modern farms or even greenhouses. As a rough estimate, an O'Neill cylinder habitat dedicated entirely to agriculture could feed a few million people. However, such structures would likely be built using only a fraction, perhaps as little as a tenth, of the mass of a typical habitat, since they wouldn't require as much shielding. Even if livestock were included, additional shielding could be selectively applied to barns. Cancer is not contagious, so while increased mutation rates could be a concern due to radiation exposure, this would be a long-term issue, one that could be mitigated by periodically introducing fresh stocks from locations with better shielding and environmental controls. Additionally, agricultural structures wouldn't require as much infrastructure. Gravity could likely be kept lower, as some evidence suggests this may aid plant growth while having no impact on microorganisms. They may also benefit from having longer daylight periods. These facilities also wouldn't need the same level of expensive shielding and hyper-redundancy as a more complex, inhabited habitat. If people were living there, their personal homesteads could have increased gravity and additional shielding in the walls and floors, with protective gear available for work in the open farm areas. More likely, however, these facilities will be dedicated to crops that require minimal crews, while more personnel-intensive agricultural operations would be housed within standard habitat cylinders. You only come to these when it's harvest time in your tractor with extra radiation shielding and an airtight cab. You can also keep crops staggered so you are always harvesting one or another. You might wonder why hydroponics isn't the primary choice, as it's often discussed for space use. The simple reality is that while hydroponics makes sense on spaceships, where mass constraints are critical, space habitats require shielding anyway, so using soil is just as practical. For more on this topic, check out our episodes on space farming and agricultural and farming planets. If we do assume we can use something like graphene superlaminate, GSL, for a habitat, and assuming the same redundancy and safety margin used for Island 3, except for the increased tensile strength, which is almost 200 times stronger, this allows us to contemplate a habitat over 1,800 miles or nearly 3,000 kilometers wide. Again, that is the McKendree Cylinder, first discussed in the 1990s, and would have around 40,000 times the living areas as an identically proportioned Island 3, hence why we call them continent-class habitats, which also covers the Bishop Ring. See that episode for details, though it might be time to give each of those their own look too. There's certainly enough material to discuss. We don't necessarily need two stations together for counter-rotation, though spinning cylinders do present gyroscopic issues. The same effect can be achieved by having a second, slightly wider and more massive cylinder nested inside the first, counter-rotating, potentially at a slower rate. This inner layer could serve as an agricultural zone and a storage area for excess water and materials, providing additional shielding. You could nest multiple habitat layers or even the primary habitat as the outermost one. There is always the question of how to handle the fact that your sky is essentially your neighbor's backyard. One solution could be a nested cylinder, essentially a thin, lightweight inner shell painted blue, or even a massive TV screen displaying a daytime or nighttime sky. In reality, I don't think this would bother people much. The central axis would contain mirrors for natural lighting, as well as microgravity facilities, and you'd still have clouds. Between incorporating hills, valleys, and overhead structures to break up the view, potentially even using permanent aerogel cloud banks with their own low-gravity ecologies, I think most people would find this an acceptable trade-off, especially compared to planetary alternatives. An O'Neill cylinder presents the challenge of creating an artificial sky, but offers complete control over weather, temperature, climate, day length, and gravity, something Mars or Venus cannot provide. There's also no natural view of space from inside, but simple airlocks could allow houses to have an underside chamber with a small pressurized dome for stargazing. However, since the habitat rotates every few minutes, the view wouldn't be like our night sky. Instead, it would likely function more like a window with a blast shutter, located in the equivalent of a garage for a personal spacecraft. Such spacecraft would be much easier and cheaper to build for interhabitat travel, as they wouldn't require atmospheric re-entry tolerances or high delta-V capabilities. If we assume this station is in Earth orbit or at a Lagrange point, and part of a network of similar habitats, the average person could own a personal ship, allowing them to travel freely within cislunar space. You have obvious radiation issues if you hang out in your garage or hangar for the view, but honestly I suspect by the 22nd century, even that radiation in low and regular doses won't be a serious health concern anymore. I think you would have transparency on at least one of the cylinder caps, but I expect you would roll blast shutters over them at night. As mentioned, I don't think transparent sections would be any larger than necessary, nor would there be mirrors bouncing light between habitats. However, if a second agricultural layer existed within the slower rotating superstructure, that might be an exception. Instead, I believe any excess light during the station's nighttime would be redirected toward energy-intensive applications, such as refining metal, producing fuel, or general manufacturing. And as mentioned, I never assume one of these stations is hanging out by itself in the void, but rather nest inside some large superstructure where many other facilities are at, all sharing some basic shielding, magnetic deflection, and point defense systems. All those huge, thin, cheap solar collectors and mirrors and radiators also act as free shielding against debris and micrometeors too. The general assumption is these habitats are built to accommodate a growing population. However, many believe humanity has already reached its peak population and may need to focus more on maintaining numbers rather than expanding living space. I disagree with that perspective and am skeptical of the entire narrative, but that's beside the point. The future will have different factors influencing population growth, likely including vastly extended lifespans, enhanced birth control technology, and improved fertility methods and windows. As a result, our current population trends are about as relevant to the long-term future as those of the 20th century, the 12th, or even the 2nd century. But even if we don't need the population space, what else would we use one for? One consideration is ecosystems. While most would function just fine within the baseline Island 3 size, we can certainly build larger habitats. However, I suspect most cylinder habitats will be as small as circumstances permit, since larger structures require stronger materials and come at a higher cost per unit of living space. Smaller cylinders also allow for more specialization, tailoring each to specific needs or preferences rather than relying on a single massive habitat. Your local capital might actually be in the smallest habitat in a conglomeration too, as it might be the original habitat the others were built as growing room for in later times. That said, larger habitats will inevitably be built where necessary, such as for preserving large ecosystems. For instance, if you want to create an elephant preserve, you might need tens of thousands of square miles to properly sustain it. There are tricks for linking multiple habitats together in a way that allows birds to travel between them, or even fish and land animals if needed. Nothing prevents you from arranging long cylinders along the edge of large 3D shapes, such as an icosahedron, then wrapping the entire structure in a massive sphere of solar collectors. This setup would create a protected, low debris and low radiation interior space that could house additional facilities. We could talk about O'Neill cylinders for hours, and some of the episodes I've mentioned explore fascinating details on their environments and construction, but I want to close with two final topics: asteroid mining settlements and interstellar arcs. First, I believe many asteroid mines will require human presence and will be gold mines not just for raw materials, but for economic growth. These will start as small outposts but will naturally expand as their mining production funds further development. I also think many O'Neill cylinders will be built on and inside asteroids, as we discussed in asteroid settlements. These locations will likely evolve into interdependent communities since they'll be far enough from Earth or other planets to require self-sufficiency. As we've noted before, a successful space colony cannot function with just a few hundred people. Once a settlement reaches a certain size, it needs multiple layers of governance, from lawyers and judges to specialists and doctors, roles that AI can assist with, but not fully replace. At least not without AI sophisticated enough to replace humans entirely, or simply count as people and thus citizens needing their own services too. The last role is in regard to interstellar arc ships. Interstellar travel presents one of the greatest engineering and societal challenges humanity could ever undertake. Amongst the most commonly proposed solutions are arc ships and generation ships, vast self-sustaining spacecraft designed to carry entire populations on journeys lasting centuries or even millennia. While many designs focus on fusion-powered craft, light sails, or even black hole drives to get the ship there as fast as you can, one of the most practical approaches may be adapting O'Neill cylinders for the task. These massive rotating habitats could serve as interstellar arcs, providing stable, Earth-like environments for long-duration missions both for the colonists and for the huge amounts of flora and fauna they will need for terraforming. Unlike smaller, more constrained spacecraft, an O'Neill cylinder-based arc could house entire ecosystems, allowing for large-scale agriculture, advanced manufacturing, and diverse social structures to persist across generations. It can also serve as their home when they arrive, as they are not likely to find much beyond barren and dead worlds when they get there, and so they may live there for more generations and use it as a hub to expand on as they grow in space and down on some new world. The main advantage of using an O'Neill cylinder for an interstellar journey is that it wouldn't feel like a ship at all, it would feel like home. Traditional generation ships run the risk of cultural and psychological stagnation, with future generations potentially forgetting or rejecting their ancestors' mission, but a well-designed O'Neill cylinder could provide a self-sufficient, expanding civilization, allowing for a population that grows and evolves naturally over time, rather than one confined to a strictly managed, ship-bound existence. Multiple O'Neill cylinders can even be linked together, forming a Rungworlds-style structure, ensuring redundancy and adaptability. Some might even argue that a civilization living in such an environment could travel indefinitely, colonizing new systems along the way rather than simply seeking one final destination, and we call these gardener ships, as they simply grow in number during journeys, stop in a system to resupply and let some colonists depart, and move on to the next strange new world. These sorts of habitats may be what they colonize a new system with too, as many systems may not have planets worth terraforming, but will almost certainly have plenty of smaller rocks to work with. In that sense, these interstellar megastructures wouldn't just be transported to another world, they'd be the foundations for humanity's permanent expansion into the cosmos. Fundamentally, as we move into the next frontier, the high frontier, or even the final frontier, O'Neill cylinders offer a way to transplant not just human communities, but entire civilizations and ecosystems. They provide a scalable method for expansion, allowing us to replicate thriving societies by the trillions, ensuring that every culture on Earth can have its own space to flourish while still leaving room for countless more to come. These habitats may be islands in space, but they can form vast archipelagos, interconnected yet diverse, each a unique world unto itself. They represent a future where humanity is not confined to one fragile planet, but instead spread across the stars with a trillion new places to call home. Lewis 1. Part of the reason I wanted the O'Neill cylinder to be near the front of our list is that I do consider it the optimal of the original designs for large-scale space habitation. As we'll see with the others, it's not the only one and may not be the most numerous habitat, even if it might make up far more total living area. But the design's popularity hardly meant it was flawless, just encouraged people to think seriously about how to improve it and related ideas. One of the best was Lewis 1, which is conceptually closer to a city, factory, shipyard, and apartment block all bolted into one enormous orbital machine. It is not as famous, and honestly the name is a little less romantic. It appeals to me because it got dreamed up at NASA Lewis Resource Center in the 1990s, which is the old name for the NASA Glenn Research Center here in Northeast Ohio, where I've lived most of my life. The renaming for John Glenn, space pioneer and longtime Ohio senator, came not long after the team at what used to be NASA Lewis proposed it. The design was developed in the early 1990s by Al Globus and colleagues, and Al is one of the longtime leaders of the National Space Society, which again I had the honor of being president of, and he also designed the Kalpana One and 2 space habitats we'll discuss later today. They and Lewis 1 belong to a later generation of space habitat thinking than the classic O'Neill Cylinder, Bernal Sphere, or Stanford Torus. Those 1970 designs were often trying to show that large space settlements were possible with fairly ordinary materials and engineering. Lewis 1 takes a somewhat different approach. It is less of a single grand world and more of a self-contained orbital industrial town, meant to support around 10,000 people, similar in scope to the Stanford Torus we'll discuss in a few minutes, but its focus is less direct habitation than helping build the next wave of space infrastructure. That distinction matters. A habitat that merely houses people is already a massive challenge, but a real settlement needs more than bedrooms, parks, and farms. It needs workshops, storage, transportation hubs, repair docks, manufacturing, power systems, recycling loops, emergency shelters, and a place where ships can dock without turning the whole neighborhood into exhaust plume. It needs to support people, but also the economy those people live in. Lewis 1 leans hard into that practical side. Physically, Lewis 1 is a large outer cylinder, roughly 2 kilometers long and about 500 meters across. But unlike an O'Neill cylinder, the whole structure is not spinning as one big inhabited world. Instead, the main outer shell is non-rotating and heavily shielded. This is an example of non-rotating superstructures often suggested as a better approach. Inside it sits a rotating gravity module where people live and work under Earth-like gravity. That rotating section is about 450 meters long and 250 meters in radius, spinning about 2 revolutions per minute to provide 1 G at the rim. That gives Lewis 1 a very different feel from an O'Neill cylinder. In the classic cylinder, the landscape itself is the inside wall of a rotating shell. Your world is a rotating pressure vessel. It is also much smaller in terms of primary residential ground. Here, the shielding, solar collectors, radiators, construction bays, and industrial systems do not all need to spin with the residential section. That is helpful because shielding is heavy, radiators are awkward, solar collectors want to point at the sun, and construction yards generally prefer not to rotate while you are trying to assemble large structures in them. That last part is not a minor detail. Lewis 1 has 2 shielded microgravity construction bays, one pressurized and one not, each large enough to hold an entire gravity module under construction. The pressurized bay could be depressurized when it's time to move a module under construction into an unpressurized bay for testing, with detachable walls between the bays and the exterior. That is a very different philosophy from the prettier habitat designs. Lewis 1 is not just a home, it's a place that builds more homes. That is probably the most important thing about it. We often talk about space habitats as they are houses, cities, or worlds, but the first truly important ones may be close to ports and factories. A frontier town does not begin as a suburb with perfect lawns and a nice school district. It begins as a supply depot, a work camp, a dock, a machine shop, a place where food, tools, shelter, and transport all meet. The romance comes later, once the mud has roads through it and the temporary buildings have brick foundations. Lewis 1 is very much in the early stage of that story, where it features cranes, pressure doors, forklifts, and someone yelling the docking collar still leaks. Needless to say, that may be exactly what we need. The rotating gravity module itself is not just one empty shell with a town painted on the inside. The living quarters are on the inner rim, with about 65 square meters, about 650 square feet, of non-agricultural space per resident, while agriculture is stacked on 6 levels farther inward, starting around 1/6 gravity and working outward in 4-meter steps. That is a clever use of spinning gravity because people might want Earth gravity for long-term health, but plants probably do not need it, and lower gravity farming decks can fit inside the same rotating volume without requiring a larger structure. This also means Lewis 1 is not quite as small as it first sounds if you only count the primary walking surface. Its basic residential ground area is tiny compared to Island 3, or even the Stanford Torus or Bernal Sphere, more like a compact town than a county in space. The design does use layered agriculture and functional volume to squeeze more utility out of that rotating module. You would not live there for sweeping sky vistas and artificial horizons. You would live there because it is a working orbital community with housing, farms, recreation, industry, and construction all packed into one protected machine. Of course, that creates complications. The rotating module sits inside an unpressurized bay, because if it's spun inside its atmosphere, the relative motion between the rotating habitat and the stationary shielding would create drag, wind, and momentum transfer problems. The paper suggests keeping the gravity module in place magnetically, which is elegant in concept but hardly trivial in operation. It also means the rotating and non-rotating pressurized areas need a transfer system. That transfer system is one of those details that makes Lewis 1 feel more real, but is also one of its obvious headaches. The proposed transfer module would attach the rotating gravity module, fill with people or cargo, seal itself, detach, spin down, attach the non-rotating microgravity area, then open. Then it reverses the whole process going the other way. The paper bluntly notes that this is a single point of failure and adds considerable operational complexity. It is one of the reasons I tend not to like mixing rotating and non-rotating components on smaller scales. Transfer gets a lot easier once your spin rate is below 1 RPM, since you have more time to comfortably move between a rotating hatch and a non-rotating one near the axis, where the tangential speed is also very small. Lighting is another major difference. Classic habitat art often loves mirrors and sunlight, and for good reason, since sunlight is free and beautiful. Lewis 1 instead uses electric lighting powered by solar collectors and beam power. That removes the complicated mirror geometry and big windows of earlier designs, and it fits the layout better, especially with agriculture stacked inside the rotating gravity module. It is less poetic than sunlight pouring through great windows, but is much easier to control, and a lot safer than leaving farm areas unshielded so workers can get a better tan from cosmic rays. Compared to that basic Bernal Sphere, or rather its later and better known redesign, Lewis 1 is not necessarily lighter or prettier. The paper itself notes the Byrne design had less total mass for the same population and used real sunlight, but Lewis 1 has more stable geometry, better shielding for inhabited areas, industrial workspaces outside the biosphere, more detailed recreation and viewing facilities, microgravity residence, and a more consistent gravity environment because it uses a cylinder rather than a sphere. I think this is also much more likely to be the scale and approach of your typical asteroid mining colony, as it is much more suited for embedding into a crater or cavern cut into an asteroid, and its design philosophy is more geared toward production and other practical concerns than simple residence. So while Lewis 1 may not be the prettiest space colony design, it may be one of the most honest ones. It tells us that space settlement is not just a miniature planet, it is also a machine for survival, a machine for industry, and eventually, a machine for making more homes. And that brings us neatly to another classic design from the same broad family of rotating habitats, one that trades industrial complexity of Lewis 1 for a simpler and more iconic shape, the Stanford Torus. The Stanford Torus is a vast space habitat design intended to allow thousands to dwell safely and comfortably in space. But how do we build such a structure? Today we'll be looking at the Stanford Torus Space Habitat, one of the best-known designs for a spin-gravity space station designed as a long-term dwelling for an entire community of humans and a true ecology. An enormous donut, often a mile wide in designs, this wheel shape can be combined with other wheels of the same size or not, around a central axis with minimal artificial gravity, while those inside the hoop benefit from full gravity caused by rotation of the hoop. The spinning wheel design, in its most well-known incarnation, would have a diameter of 1,790 meters, or 1.11 miles, mass at least 10 megatons, mostly in radiation shielding, and house an estimated 10,000 people at an estimated 67 square meters or 721 square feet per person. Bigger designs are possible, as are smaller ones, as this radius, 895 meters, or 2,936 feet, was selected for it and other designs, as is the radius that spinning object can have while rotating exactly once per minute, 1 RPM, and producing the 9.8 meters per second that we call normal gravity. Today we'll be both looking at the basics, for folks who don't know it, and deep diving some aspects for the folks who are already quite familiar with it. So no prior knowledge is needed, but it doesn't hurt either. While not the first design by any means, the Stanford Torus was an in-depth design with serious analysis and emerged in 1975, roughly at the same time Gerard K. O'Neill's Island 1, 2, and 3 designs, the latter being the O'Neill cylinder we so often mention on the show.
Both approaches are immense and designed for many thousands to even hundreds of thousands of people. Back in 1975, NASA conducted a summer study at Stanford University and released some findings. After concluding humans needed pseudogravity or spin gravity to live, and bringing up the von Braun wheel design, and Arthur C. Clarke's examples in sci-fi, like the giant spinning cylinder ship in his 1973 novel, Rendezvous with Rama, they present 4 principal shapes for discussion. The first is a sphere, hollow and spinning like a planet does, only you live on the inside and centrifugal force holds you down. This is basically the Bernal Sphere, which will give its own deep dive in a couple months. The second is a cylinder rotating on its long axis, and is generally the other preferred design, namely the Island 3 O'Neill cylinder, which we've done a few videos on but may update next year. The fourth is where we take a dumbbell and spin it around, what we often call a hammer hab or a bolo hab, and this will get an episode in early spring 2025, as it is in some ways the easiest approach, especially when you're just trying to give gravity to a small crew for a long trip. Number 3 is the Torus design, which is a ring habitat that has a circular tube, the donut, rather than simply a flat ribbon, since walls and ceilings are a good idea. This is obviously the main focus for today, and all 4 approaches got a detailed look in that study, but the Torus design inherited the name of the study, and the study did conclude that while the Torus was not the best design in many respects, it seemed to give the best desirable balance of qualities they were reviewing. I generally tend to favor Type 4, the hammer habitat for interplanetary ships, and the cylinder for bulk habitation. The sphere tends to be a bit of a holdover, as Bernal proposed it way back near the beginning of the century and it latched onto people's consciousness. It does have some pros, but its big con is that it's a spinning sphere and has no gravity at the poles and full gravity only at the equator. This can be useful sometimes. You might like your docking ports at those zero-G poles and your residential quarters for people down at the equator. A cone-shaped habitat also has this varying gravity, as would a hemisphere, like an orange sliced in half, that had a big window to let light in through that flat slice section, which might be an option for asteroid mines or cheap farm habitats. Similarly, while we envision the Stanford Torus as a torus or hoop or donut, that toroid could be a hexagon instead of a circle for its cross-section. This might be more structurally sound, and you end up having that on the outside or bottom edge anyway for flooring, since nobody wants to walk on a curved floor, especially as the gravity won't point at the floor but at an angle. One area the torus beats the cylinder in very handily is the amount of air needed inside one, as the hoop has a roof whereas the cylinder goes all the way to the other side and needs to be filled with air for its entirety. Now, for a lot of folks, spin gravity is a well-known concept. We've discussed it in many episodes, particularly our Megastructures playlist, so we'll keep it concise for today, but here's the basics. First, if you ever had someone tell you that centrifugal force is not real, while that statement is not exactly wrong, it is usually being said by folks who terribly misunderstood the concept. What qualifies as a real force is very debatable, but saying centrifugal force isn't real because it's actually the wall or floor shoving back on you as you accelerate around a curve is not really any more useful than saying electromagnetic force is not real because it's transmitted by virtual photons, not real ones. You can ask your laundry how real centrifugal force is when it emerges from your washer without water dripping from it. What we usually call the 4 fundamental forces these days started with gravity, electric, and magnetic fields, and those were something we found could pull or push on stuff without touching it. We realized later that electric and magnetic fields were 2 aspects of the same force, electromagnetism, and found there was another pair of forces at work at the subatomic scale, the strong and weak nuclear force. And indeed, the weak nuclear force combines with electric and magnetic forces into what we call the electro-weak force. There's also a lot of debate on if gravity is real or a pseudo-force here. Under general relativity, it is indistinguishable from acceleration. And in reality, this is misleading because we do not mean actual versus fake. It's just the names that got slapped on these things as we discovered them and tried to classify them for simplicity of discussion. This is a regular problem in science. We find something new and have to name and classify it to usefully discuss it, but by definition don't yet understand it. so the names in taxonomy tend to later turn out to be poor choices, and physics and astronomy are full of them. Mundane forces are things touching each other and shoving. If you push or pull on a doorknob, this is essentially the electromagnetic force in action. It's not a fake force, and neither is centripetal or centrifugal force. And I am glad to say folks have mostly stopped repeating the centrifugal force doesn't exist truism. It was rampant when the show first started 10 years back, and inevitably made folks wonder if spin gravity would work. If you want an example of it working, look at the space station, and gravity is just a few percent lower there, or on any of our other manned craft besides the Apollo missions. Those folks were all weightless because they were spinning around the planet, orbiting, and their centrifugal force equaled their gravitational force, producing a zero or microgravity environment. But you can test this by moving to different places between our equator and poles and seeing how weight shifts. It's a small but very real amount, as Earth's spin at the equator produced the highest centrifugal force, counteracting gravity, while the amount at the poles is zero. The equation for this is pretty straightforward, and I'll give it to you in two formats, though in both cases as the acceleration rather than the force. Force is mass times acceleration. Your weight is a force. But except for discussing the stress on the station from being under spin, we only care about the acceleration rate and getting it to 9.8 meters or 32 feet per second, what we call 1g, 1 regular Earth gravity. That acceleration can be written as equaling the square velocity divided by the radius of your spin. That velocity, also called your tangential velocity, is how fast you're moving out of that radius and what you spin off at if you let go of the floor or rope or whatever you're attached to keep you spinning. For the Stanford Torus, that's about 94 meters per second or 209 miles per hour. Pretty fast, and a good way to give ships departing a little kick free of your station so they turn their drives on so they're further away. If you're docking on a station this way from a ship that keeps gravity by constant acceleration, like ships in the Expanse do, rather than by rotation, you dock with your ship prow, front, or nose to the outside edge of the ring and crawl up through that into the edge of that ring, which is the floor of the habitat. So we calculate that by, again, setting our desired g's on the left and the square of that tangential velocity divided by the radius on the right. We can alternatively do this by instead having the angular velocity squared on the right, then multiplying it by the radius rather than dividing. Your angular velocity isn't a speed in meters or feet or miles per second or hour or whatever. Instead, it's how long you take to complete a rotation. Rotation per minute, or RPM, are an example, and a big wheel at 1 RPM is rotating as fast as a smaller wheel at a tenth its diameter, but it is also spinning a tangential speed at its edge 10 times higher. We also often calculate size for stations at 2 RPM, because that lets us make a smaller station with the same gravity, 1/4 as wide, as the angular velocity squared, being twice as high, is 4, and thus a radius 1/4 as wide will give us the same acceleration at 2 RPM as one at 1 RPM would. We tend to hesitate to go fast than that for fear of nausea. We can probably do 6 RPM, but we are not sure everyone could, or that every organism we want to bring along could. We are pretty confident it's not lower than 2 RPM. The faster we spin it, the more Coriolis force people endure, and for starters, it would cause nausea and other discomforting effects in many people. The wider your station, and the slower your rotation, the less these problems are. But until we build some prototypes, it will be hard to know how humans and other organisms handle higher rotational rates. Bigger is better, but you will tend to build your rotating space habitat not wider than you have to. That 1 RPM structure is under constant strain, and exactly equal to what a suspension bridge on Earth would have if it were as long as that station's circumference is. So a long bridge on Earth looped into a circle, make it 1/4 as wide, and that station can be a lot thinner or sturdier, and presumably cheaper. You can add more living space by adding more length down the axis, a longer cylinder for cylinder habitats, or an extra wheel for a wheel-on-axle setup. One caveat on that though, space is nasty. It's virtually empty, and the only reason it isn't totally empty is because it's full of dangerous radiation and hypervelocity rocks that might be as small as bullets, yet carry the force to tear through a tank's armor. As a result, you need a lot of shielding, and for that summer study in 1975, the Stanford Torus has 150,000 tons of structural mass holding it together, another 44,000 tons of air, and a whopping 9,900,000 tons of shielding. That doesn't include any people or equipment, just the raw station and air to breathe, and is 10.1 megatons, 98% of which is shielding, and just over 1% of which is structure. And this is the one that's a mile wide already and designed by those engineers using known materials of the time. In this case, aluminum. Strong and lightweight materials, in terms of tensile strength, are your preferred structural materials for rotating habitats, same as for suspension bridges. But if you need that much shielding, you might build out of something cheaper or that's shielded better. That shielding is critical to the space habitat concept though, because mass is never your friend in space, and thus a space habitat with lawns and gardens and lakes always seems like a crazy idea until you remember that shielding issue. Plus, while all space habitats are by definition spaceships, we usually don't plan to move them much once we get them built and into their orbit. So instead of using lead, or whatever material works best against radiation, gram for gram, you might use soil and water. The calculation used throughout the 1975 study assumes 4.5 tons of shielding per square meter, or 0.42 tons per square foot, a bit over 400 pounds. Just taking that as is, that would represent 4.5 meters or 15 feet of water in terms of mass, and more like 3 meters or 10 feet of soil, depending on the type of soil and wetness. For my part, I think you would do more, but I'm not sure you'd use actual soil for that in favor of just using regolith, with a thinner layer of soil above. This is also why we don't think of such stations as fragile. It takes a lot to punch through a hull that's made of meter-thick aluminum or steel, and even more to then carry yourself through whatever dirt and water they have on top of that. For the original designs, the specified habitat was to be big enough to house 10,000 people. The cylinder and sphere version both massively exceeded that population because they were trying for the 1 RPM rotational rate and thus had a huge radius still and much more living area. As mentioned, we have a big contest every year with tens of thousands of students entering worldwide, and the finalist teams get to present them at our annual International Space Development Conference. Walking around to see those posters is one of my favorite parts of the ISDC. The majority of the designs are either variations of the Stanford Torus or the O'Neill Cylinder, with good reason. They are basically your core designs. I remember one of the student designs had a hoop 12 kilometers in radius. Given that one of the students on that team was probably only 12 themselves, I wasn't going to criticize it, but there's really not much point to building that wide in major radius while sticking to a torus design. It makes sense for the Banks orbital or ring world because both are trying to take advantage of the actual sun in their lighting. The ring world is built to wrap a star entirely and at its Goldilocks zone distance, while the Banks orbital is that wide to have a rotational rate of exactly 1 day, not 1 minute. Thus, like the Stanford Torus, they have to build to a certain diameter and create the smallest habitat able to do that. In practice, you really haven't got much reason to build a torus habitat out past its 2 RPM radius of about 225 meters, let alone beyond the 1 RPM radius, as if you need more living room, you just go for the cylinder habitat or make your donut more flat. Instead of a circular cross-section, you build one more elliptical, or even just a ring with walls and a dome. In this way, you could even have 2 rings touching, and if they're the same diameter, share space through cross tunnels, presumably with airlocks. Or you could rebuild the roofs as a single one, but there's a lot to be said about being able to slam some pressure doors down between 2 separate sections. This means you can keep adding rings as you go, extending the central axis they connect to. Indeed, if you want to, you could make that long central axis eventually curve around into a hoop itself, and on lower gravity objects, like most asteroids, you could build the first donut right over the surface and slowly add more each way, up and down as you mind. Agricultural hoops are also much cheaper. We are pretty sure plants need less gravity to be healthy, allowing you to build the ring longer, and radiation is a much smaller concern. You probably would only need just enough for the structure and soil, which might only need to be a foot or 2, or maybe half a meter deep. The same reasoning applies as with populated ones versus cylinder habitats. Land area in a cylinder is cheaper to build. So I generally tend to think the Stanford Torus isn't your city or small nation in space, but your village or modestly large town, port of call, or even a single family dwelling. As we mentioned, the basic design, the one over a mile across, masses 10 megatons, and 98% of that is shielding or dirt and water. Depending on how you lay that out, you've got something like half a square mile, 300-ish acres, or a bit over a square kilometer of land area, or land and lakes. If you're laying that out as a landscape and want hills or deeper lakes, you just insert big hollow bumps or dimples up or down the floor. That would seem like a ridiculous luxury for a single family, and we could build it at a quarter that size for the 2 RPM habitat, major and minor radius each quartered, which would still be almost 40 acres or 15 hectares. But let's consider that bigger version. The asteroid belt alone is barely 1% of our moon's mass, which in turn is barely 1% of Earth's mass, and has enough mass to build 239 billion such habitats. So one per family isn't really pushing it even for that bigger version. We tend to assume pretty good automation and energy abundance when building space habitats anyway, and given the rising desire for bigger homes and lawns, I don't think we should rule out everybody wanting their own 40-acre farm, or 400. There's also way more mass out there to work with, without even talking about disassembling planets or engaging in star lifting. One big moon like ours, or one of the Galileans around Jupiter, could let you build enough for maybe 100 trillion of those 2 RPM donut habitats. I should also note the shielding doesn't have to be rotating itself. You don't really want to be able to see outside space in a habitat that's spinning around every minute or so. As a result, nesting your habitation hoop or drum inside a larger non-rotating superstructure means you can pile bulk matter into that without structural concerns. That's handy if they are some mining outpost that wants an inflatable or telescoping habitation ring they can blow up on arrival, throw a thin shell around, and pile leftovers from their mining operation on. That shell holding up meters-thick regolith and rubble doesn't need to be very strong, given that less than 1% of asteroids have even 1% of Earth's gravity. Smaller ones are way more common, and on most of them, you could personally deadlift the structural mass of a Stanford Torus, assuming you could keep that lift going for potentially hours, given that you still need to overcome that inertial mass. So that might need to be a team effort. Regardless, a thin shell over such a ring need not be very strong to hold up all the shielding it would need on your typical asteroid, comet, or minor moon. Of course, if you cover it over, you can't get any light in, and free sunlight is always nice. We tend to assume the empty middle of the hoop has angled mirrors, allowing you to bounce light in, and only those frequencies or wavelengths you want. You could put a big parabolic mirror out behind one to catch even more sunlight for habitats built in space far from the sun. For one on an asteroid, where that asteroid itself probably spins around every few hours, having some big reflective solar sails and lenses tethered to the asteroid can keep light going into that habitat at the amounts you want when you want them. Giant reflective thin mirrors are also great for power generation and limited station keeping. That only handles photonic radiation, not charged particles, but those mostly come from the sun and aren't going to bounce off a mirror around your shielding into the habitat. I should note that a giant spinning ring with a power supply makes a pretty good magnet for deflecting particles, but in fact it would make more sense to run a power cable out to some electromagnet between you and the particle radiation source. Distance matters more than power when it comes to deflecting particles magnetically. The other thing to keep in mind about space habitats is that it's easy enough to put a bunch of them in about the same place, and even keep them lashed together with tethers for transport, power, and high-speed data transfer. So you could have 100 smaller donut habitats loosely bound to several square kilometers of solar panels, a few dozen dedicated farming habitats, and a variety of space docks, factories, defensive installations, and zero-G environments. You might see this around a lot of points of interest too, or even see a bigger station like O'Neill cylinders with a flock of Stanford Tori bound to them. Why? Well, as we said, you get more living area out of the cylinder designs, especially when you want big habitats that might be a dozen miles wide and long. The default Island 3 design has 80,000 acres in it. but often you won't have that many people. You need comfortable room for 1,000 employees and their families. One Stanford Torus does the job. One O'Neill cylinder would be rather excessive unless the culture and resources of the time demanded 80 acres of family, which shouldn't even need 1 acre to feed them with modern agricultural tech. The other side of that equation is that if you or I go buy a house on an O'Neill cylinder, same as if we bought one in some suburb here on Earth, we might find we like our home and garden quite a lot, but really dislike our neighbors. Every space habitat is a spaceship. So if a big cylinder habitat decides it's tired of being part of a country or a state, it can move, whereas a county in a US state can't just pick up and leave. Yes, you could in theory threaten to invade or blow them up. Space habitats are not super fragile and are a nightmare to invade, as we discussed elsewhere. But from a diplomatic perspective, it's a lot easier for a country to claim a piece of it can't just up and become some other country, so everybody tends to shrug at succession movements without real and massive tyranny involved. Same for if you decide you don't want to be in a city or township. You can sell your home and move, but the land stays. But a big cylinder habitat of 1 million folks is much heavier to decide to move away and to find a new parking place for them than a more modest Torus habitat. Same, you could build one faster and cheaper, as you could a house compared to an apartment building, even if the latter was more economical on a per-person basis. Needless to say, we build both and not just in cities. So I think you'd have way more of the smaller Torus designs than bigger cylinder habitats, though you might have more total people living in the latter, say 10 times more donuts than cans, but the cans hold 20 times as many people. It will also be a lot longer before we not only have 1 million people living in space, but actually have 1 million people needing to live the same place in space, whereas 100 Torus habitats might spread around to 100 different useful areas under development, and more added with time. As we noted earlier, you could have multiple wheels on the same axle touching and sharing a roof for expansion into a cylinder habitat eventually. It may be several centuries before we need even one O'Neill cylinder, while we might already have built thousands of real habitats. In the end, it will come down to how cheap we can build them. It may be the mass needed per person will trump the construction cost as a factor. But for now, millions of available asteroids look like abundant and accessible supplies of building material. I don't think we'll build one of them this century. It's still a lot of space needing thousands of folks living or working in space to justify building some. But we might, and I don't think it'll be too far in the future before we see folks in a Stanford Torus.
Kalpana 1 and 2. In addition to Lewis 1, our Globus also helped develop another pair of habitats that we use images of all the time without always naming them, Kalpana 1 and Kalpana 2. If you're a channel regular, you know the Kalpana 1 inside and out, as we often use the visuals done by my good friend Brian Versteeg of SpaceHabs.com. Those beautiful interior clips we often show, with the curved landscape, parks, water, buildings, and a bright artificial sky overhead, have done much to shape the modern public imagination of space habitats, and for the better. Kalpana 1 is named for one of the astronauts lost the Columbia shuttle in 2003, and the name is fitting in a deeper sense too. Kalpana means imagination or idea in Sanskrit, and this is very much a design about turning the grand old dream of space settlement into something more immediate and more compact. At first glance, Kalpana 1 looks like a little O'Neill cylinder or the Bernal Sphere, which we'll be deep diving in a few minutes, but that is not quite right. Kalpana 1 is short and wide, closer to a thick drum. The common figure is about 250 meters in radius and 325 meters long, spinning about 2 revolutions per minute to provide Earth normal gravity at the rim. It is also expected to mass around 7 million tons, more than 10,000 times what the International Space Station masses. That's huge, but for context, a single O'Neill cylinder often gets cited at more like 7 billion tons. So compared to Island 3, this is tiny, but tiny here still means a structure orders of magnitude larger than any permanent object humanity has ever built in space, and meant to house thousands of people. I want to stress that it really isn't the structure. Virtually all that mass is about shielding, and relying on dirt and water to get the job done. So we assume you dump a lot of cheap regolith from the moon here, and water from icy bodies deeper out, and throw in various bacteria while it sloshes around till you get soil. You may or may not be building your structure from resources mined off Earth when you build one of these. Maybe every girder and other bit of equipment gets launched from space, but 99 to 99.9% of the mass is that shielding, and can be gotten off-world without anything high-tech or heavy in industrial complexity involved. Incidentally, that short, wide shape is not an accident. One of the problems with a long cylinder is that it can have stability issues, especially as it's not paired with a counter-rotating twin or otherwise carefully managed. For a more developed spacefaring civilization, that is not a big deal, but early on it certainly is. So by making it shorter and wider, you get something easier to stabilize, easier to shield, and easier to imagine as an early large settlement. You give up the magnificent sweeping scale of the classical neo-cylinder, but you're getting something that feels much closer to your first practical town in orbit. Kalpana One also reflects a more modern attitude toward lighting and shielding. The older habitat designs often relied heavily on giant windows and mirror systems to bring sunlight directly inside, which makes for beautiful art but also complicates radiation protection, thermal control, and structural design. Kalpana One tends to feel more enclosed and controlled. The landscape is still open by human standards with sky, parks, streets, and water, but is not trying to be a transparent greenhouse in space. It is more like a protected indoor world, where the sky is engineered, the lighting is controlled, and the shell is there to keep the universe politely outside. That may sound less romantic, but it is probably close to what early large habitats would really be like. People often imagine space settlements as miniature planets, but the first successful ones might feel more like gigantic malls, airports, gardens, campuses, and cruise ships blended together, except the outside is vacuum, and the basement contains life support machinery that everyone is politely pretending not to worry about. You can also concentrate light and send it through small windows to bounce or scatter off some internal mirrors or prisms, as an alternative to electric lighting, but also remember that solar panel arrays can get pretty immense and cheap up there, and microwave beaming pretty safe. I think a key thing about Kalpana One is that it looks livable, partially due to Bryan's amazing renderings, but critically, it looks not just survivable, but generally and pleasantly livable. You can imagine children running along paths, people sitting by water, apartments stacked up the curve, and sunlight that feels normal even though none of it is accidental. It presents a space habitat not as a metal corridor and not as a continent-sized megastructure, but as something between a town and a building. A place large enough to have neighborhoods, but small enough you can still believe it might be built before the solar system is already paved in orbital industry. Now, Kalpana 2, as the name suggests, is a later development of the same family of thinking, not a total rejection of Kalpana 1. 2 is actually much smaller than Kalpana 1, down to a 4 RPM 50-meter radius cylinder, aiming to house about 500 folks. It gains a lot of mass back, going to a mere 8.5 kilotons instead of 7,000 kilotons in the first design, by aiming to be in low Earth orbit over the equator, where it doesn't need any more shielding than the ISS. As a reminder, virtually all of your shielding in space is about protecting you from cosmic rays, which are mostly bare protons moving at incredibly high speeds and vastly harder to shield against than alpha, beta, gamma, or neutron radiation. Unlike all of those, they are charged particles, so magnetic fields deflect them and Earth provides a strong one that close. Ultimately, Kalpana 2 therefore aims to be a maximally compact body, scaling down to von Braun wheel size and capacities, but I would still call it a space habitat, or at least a settlement, rather than merely a station. And once we have the compact rotating town in mind, we can turn back to one of the classic shapes of the 1970s, a design that originally went for microgravity, but whose later form has the same basic need for spin gravity and wraps into perhaps the most iconic small habitat geometry of all, the Bernal Sphere. Civilization does not usually end because one thing goes wrong. It ends because one rare catastrophe arrives before anyone has built the tools, backups, and redundancies to survive it. Ice ages, solar flares, rogue planets, supernovae, lost archives, failed recoveries. These are not just disasters. They are stress tests for whether a civilization has become durable. That is the idea behind my new Nebula Plus collection, Cosmic Catastrophes and Survival. It gathers my Nebula-exclusive episodes on extinction risks, planetary disasters, civilization backups, and rebuilding after collapse. This month's new edition is Nearby Supernovae. Could one destroy Earth, and could we stop it? Where we look at whether exploding stars have threatened Earth before, which nearby stars might eventually explode, and whether a future civilization could shield itself, move the danger away, or harvest the aftermath. If that sounds like your sort of rabbit hole, you can find the full collection on Nebula, along with years of SFA exclusives, collections, bonus episodes, and regular episodes early and ad-free. My link or the QR code gets you 50% off an annual plan, or 40% off lifetime access.
Imagine a vast, self-sustaining habitat floating in the depths of space, where entire communities could live, work, and flourish in a garden park world tailored to their needs and desires. The Bernal Sphere is one of the earliest and most iconic visions of a space habitat, conceptualized by John Desmond Bernal in 1929. This bold idea presented a self-sustaining, rotating spherical structure 10 miles wide designed to house thousands of people in space. The sphere's rotation would create artificial gravity on its inner surface, enabling residents to live and work in an Earth-like environment. With provisions for agricultural zones, living quarters, and energy systems that harness solar power, the Bernal Sphere offered a comprehensive approach to human settlement beyond Earth, addressing fundamental needs such as food production, atmosphere control, and radiation protection. Bernal's concept inspired future space architects and science fiction creators by presenting the vision of a permanent, habitable outpost in space. It laid the groundwork for later, more complex designs like Gerard Cahill's space habitats, and influenced the broader discussion on space colonization. The Bernal Sphere embodies the ambition of expanding human civilization to the stars, envisioning not just survival, but the possibility of thriving in the cosmos. Today, we'll be exploring the design, its pros and cons, and when or if we should build one. But we should probably start with one common misconception. The Bernal Sphere is not the first space station design, either in science or science fiction. Who holds that title is difficult to say, but Edward Everett Hale's 1869 short story in The Atlantic, The Brick Moon, qualifies as a very basic space station or manned satellite, while Hugo Gernsback, often called the father of science fiction, would give a brief but slightly more scientific exploration of an orbital platform in 1911. Hermann Oberth, one of the fathers of rocketry alongside Tchaikovsky and Goddard, would go on to discuss using them in his 1923 book, translated from German as The Rocket into Planetary Space, where he discussed the potential for human space travel and the practical use of space stations as stepping stones for interplanetary exploration. Indeed, he would discuss the basic wheel design that uses centrifugal force to simulate gravity that Wernher von Braun later expanded on and popularized as the von Braun space wheel, and he was also the first to suggest solar power for running the station's life support, and that such a station might serve as exactly that, a station for ships stopping by before heading into a wider voyage. We tend not to think of space stations as refueling points these days, since none of our current or past stations, over a dozen to date, has served in that role, but I thought it was a good point to note for today because while Bernal Sphere wasn't the first space station design, it was the first space habitat design that I'm aware of, and a space habitat might serve as a waypoint for travelers and trade, but is fundamentally designed meant for living and supporting a community. We tend to discuss O'Neill cylinders a bit more often on the show, but in fact the cylinder design was O'Neill's Island 3 design. Island 1 is simply an updated, detailed, and slightly smaller version of Bernal's original sphere, while Island 2 is a reimagining of it to be a bit bigger and more elongated than spherical, and that is the design you will probably most often see and tends to be called a Bernal Sphere, even if it's quite different than Bernal's original design. We'll be looking over all three today, Bernal's design in Island 1 and 2, as well as some other approaches to the concept. If that sounds like fun, grab a drink and a snack, hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more discussions of space, science, and futurism. If you didn't already know, I'm the president of the National Space Society, which is actually international, but the name is left over from when the National Space Institute, founded by von Braun, and the L5 Society, inspired by O'Neill's work, merged in the mid-1980s. The NSS is not solely focused on paving the way for giant space habitats, but it tends to be one of our central long-term goals, and hosting design competitions for these space habitats, from students to experts, is one of the ways we do that. So as you might imagine, I'm familiar with a lot of variations on the core designs for space habitats, and of course it was a keen interest of mine even before I joined the NSS, and indeed was the motivation and topic for our very first episode of the show, the Megastructure Summary, which briefly detailed a large number of space habitats and other structures. But this is also part of the reason why detailing the original Bernal Sphere is a bit tricky. Tons of engineers have looked at the idea down the years, but Bernal himself didn't dip into many details in his discussion of it. It appears in his 1920 essay, The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, which is unrelated to the 1959 post-apocalyptic film of the same name, drawing out the Latin version Mundus Caro et Diabolus, which St. Thomas Aquinas singled out as the three sources of temptation and implacable enemies of the soul. You might be wondering what it has to do with space habitats, and the answer is not much. The text discusses everything from the space habitat to wireless power, cyborgs, transhumanism, and hive minds, with a large dose of his personal politics. But the subsection on the Bernal Sphere, which is the truly memorable part in my opinion, feels almost like it hijacks the work as it takes up most of the second section, the world, of the six-section work. He essentially shifts from talking about the progress and efficiency of food production by modern science to how the world's limited land area will always be a constraining factor on growth, and the nascent notion of a Dyson sphere pops up here as he notes how the sun gives off 2 billion times more sunlight than the Earth receives. So he is overtly discussing this as a space habitat made for the purpose of letting more people exist and how we should build many of them, that it has citizens, not just employees. This to me is the more revolutionary idea than the station details itself, as it acknowledges that even all the other planets in the solar system, if made habitable, don't add that much more living area for humanity, while the power and resources available to those building space habitats is several orders of magnitude higher, generally 1 million to 1 billion times more. So the Bernal Sphere isn't just a waypoint to explore new worlds, a novel place to visit, but rather where most people might live. As to the specifics, the reality is his design was not particularly good, especially as we learned more about space. For instance, he suggests detecting dangerously large meteorites by the effect of their gravitational fields, or vaporizing them with jets of gas or electron beams. Ironically, the part of it long considered the weakest, in the literal sense, is that the outside be completely transparent to let sunlight in. He basically envisioned a crystal ball or snow globe. This is a bit more plausible with modern science, where manufacturing the outside of something ultra strong and transparent, like diamond, is on the table. He is thinking of this outer layer as the membrane of a cell through which power enters to run an outer mechanical layer. While it's a 10-mile wide sphere, Bernal assumed only the inner 8 miles, or 13 kilometers, with a spherical living area of 201 square miles, 521 square kilometers, 5,200 hectares, or 129,000 acres, for whichever best lets you visualize the living space. Folks already familiar with space habitat designs are probably wondering why he wants light coming in through the floor, but the structure isn't rotating for spin gravity. He is actually assuming these habitats are awesome because they are free of bad weather and gravity, and thus also made houses mostly superfluous. And beyond granting the possible need for some smaller soundproof cells, he was assuming we'd all float around happily and get used to the low gravity. We didn't actually know zero gravity was unhealthy to the 1960s, when we had people spend a fair amount of time in it, and that's pretty much when we see the rotating designs come in. I think for space station designs, even when folks wondered about a lack of gravity being unpleasant, they weren't assuming serious and short-term health downsides yet. Once that became the case, we see von Braun's space wheel as the space station version, and shortly after we see folks like O'Neill point out we could just spin Bernal's sphere around. If you're curious, one rotation every 3 minutes will give it normal gravity, at the equator anyway. But it's important to note that the original Bernal Sphere wasn't a spin gravity habitat, which it is now one of the 4 most famous examples of, others being the cylinder, rings, or torus hoop. Rather, this initial Bernal Sphere is what we often call a bubble hab or free-floating hab. Once we talk about turning it into a spin gravity station, we start some re-engineering. First, there's no reason to have the floor under people be where the sun comes in, and where it would be turning on and off every 3 minutes, unless your pole was pointed at the sun, instead leaving one half eternally lit and the other always dark. And it just introduces structural weakness, which is unwelcome in a station that now has significant centrifugal force on that structure. Those poles are also very low gravity too. There's no spin at the pole itself, so as you leave the equator, gravity drops. That's fine in some ways, as low gravity can be handy. You might like sleeping at 1G but working at half gravity, and probably a lot of organisms would adapt well to those spots. You might get some awesome trees in quarter gravity, for instance. You also need some place for the sunlight to come in, so it's often imagined that one pole of the sphere is a window facing the sun, and either you close that at night times or spin the habitat on its other axis so that it rotates not just every 3 minutes for gravity, but also the other direction once every 24 hours for daylight. It is also structurally more solid than a simple cylinder, as those big cylinder caps are not exactly their preferred engineering. This is why we get the Island 2 design, which replaces the sphere with some more elongated structure akin to an egg. There's a small percentage of low-gravity areas in this approach compared to a sphere, though the ring and cylinder approaches have uniform gravity from uniform radius of rotation. Note that both Island 1 and 2 are a lot smaller than Bernal Sphere. Island 2 is only about a mile wide, not 10, and Island 1 is 0.31 miles or 500 meters in diameter, and would need to rotate about twice per minute for spin gravity, which would get to be nauseating unless you were pointed right at the sun and it stayed centered. It would drown out the rotating stars, much as our sun does during daytime, but like the Stanford Torus design, the later Bernal Sphere concepts tend to incorporate mirrors to bring sunlight in. We generally do not assume Bernal spheres are actually spheres anymore, but then an O'Neill cylinder is rarely designed with flat caps either. Both tend to assume you use a hemisphere as a cap, or maybe a somewhat flattened one. The line between an ovoid-shaped habitat and a hemispherically capped cylinder can get a bit arbitrary, though having a slight change in radius along the axis can help supplement weather and terrain by giving you downhill and uphill and variations in air pressure. A full and proper sphere obviously does this much more, and only about 3/4 of the surface area of a spinning sphere is experiencing more than half the gravity the equator does, and only 2/3 experience even 3/4 gravity or more. I think in a real spherical habitat we would probably push the gravity up to 20 or 30% higher than Earth's just to ensure most of the territory was at Earth gravity, or close to it. You probably end up with a river or lake or sea along the equator too. Higher gravity doesn't affect buoyancy unless you are intentionally building deep seas beyond the depth light normally penetrates. The slightly faster rise in pressure underwater won't matter much. All this change to pressure and gravity ought to give you a decent weather cycle, which might be preferable to the more tame one a simple ring or cylinder might produce. Although as I am recording this after plowing my driveway free from 4 feet of snow, I would argue that we only want so much weather variation. But we have another issue too. Spin gravity only points away from the axis of rotation. So if you're standing on a sphere, you're thinking you point head first toward the middle with the ground flat under you, but instead the ground is curved spherically while the gravity points to the axis. Only at the equator is it properly aligned with the ground. That means out at a 45-degree angle, not only is the gravity down to 71%, it is facing diagonally from the ground. This also means that not just air and water, but also dirt and mud will slowly drip down from the polar regions to the equator. This is not fatal though. You could create many tiered levels, themselves flat around the axis of rotation, so gravity points the right way. We might assume each tier represented a 1% decrease in gravity, starting from that equatorial river belt, which in this case would be about 0.6 miles or 1 kilometer wide. Your tiers are all vertically the same height higher than the last, as gravity from spin is proportional to radius, so on a 10-mile diameter or 5-mile radius station with 100 tiers on each hemisphere, it is rising 264 feet or 80 meters a level. These ring-shaped tiers or bands are not equally wide though, and subsequent tiers are decreasing not just in gravity but land area. So when gravity is just 1% lower, you got about 9.1 square miles or 24 square kilometers, while at half gravity the tier is down to about 1.4 square miles or 3.7 square kilometers, and the spot with less than 1% gravity is just 0.16 square miles or 0.41 square kilometers. I tend to assume neighborhoods would not simply be these bands, though addresses might be, and I would bet the bands would be more numerous and more likely the equivalent to a normal flight of stairs. Under all this is dirt, but even if the weather helps you, you probably have a lot of small lakes and ponds on higher tiers and active water pumping going on below ground to move from the central ring sea to the polar mountains. You might have some awesome waterfalls here too, either one that went down hundreds of small waterfalls with each tier, or one that did many tiers at once. And these tiers do not have to be flat walls, we can add curvature, where a tier band doesn't run the same distance from the equator its whole length, or to the vertical too. You really won't notice the floor being 1 degree of gravity off. That's typically what most decks and balconies have to keep rainwater from pooling up, or to let melting snow drip off, so you might have a spot where you ran down long smooth slopes or where you had even more and shorter tiers, like you want fish like salmon to be able to move upstream. You also don't need to have water run directly along the axis. Rivers meander naturally anyway, so you can have more modest slopes for your rivers in the structure by having them move on winds and sideways. Normally land we live on has slopes from the center of the island and the continents to sea level. I live in northeast Ohio by Lake Erie, currently experiencing lake effect snow, at an elevation of 275 meters or 900 feet, and in the hundreds of miles that water flows to from when it rolls off my own balcony, down to the Ashebula River, down to the lake, and eventually out to the Atlantic Ocean, the slope is about 2% of a single degree. River speeds vary by a number of factors, but slope is one of them. A moderate river can have a slope of 1%, and fast ones much more. I am obviously a big fan of Gerard K. O'Neill and his highly influential book The High Frontier, where these structures get discussed, and he just as obviously had time and space constraints on how many examples he wanted to give, but I always wished he had included a few more in-between cases, including a full-size Bernal Sphere. Again, a 10-mile wide Bernal Sphere has 314 square miles of land. The 8-mile living area version would be 201, and has only 64% the land area of the 10-mile version, but then Island 2, depending on the version, has just a tenth the radius and 1% the area, or a fifth the radius and 4% the area, and Island 1 is just 0.39% the area. A 10-mile sphere is hardly big by our channel size. We considered structures even into the light-year scale, but it's legitimate to ask how often we would really need to build even that big. You are probably much more population dense in one of these habitats than a random chunk of modern Earth, which is only 16 people per square kilometer or 41 people per square mile. That jumps to 54 and 139 if we cut out the oceans and only do land. If we use that figure, we would expect 43,646 people per 10-mile sphere. We could probably do a lot more. Ohio is hardly known for being densely packed and has nearly twice that density. But then we also need to either put a fake sun in the center of this globe or leave a decent window in one of the poles. The window doesn't have to be full size, incidentally. We can use mirrors to concentrate light in through that window and widen that incident angle, or move it closer to the sun. Indeed, you could flip the opening around backwards, facing away from the sun, and have a giant parabolic mirror behind the sphere bouncing light back into it, gathered from a much larger area, so as to allow such a sphere to be comfortable even when as far from the sun as Pluto is. Alternatively, a smaller pinhole shape, able to let sunlight in and diffuse around, with the rest of the sphere covered in mirrors, could also let a habitat be even closer than Mercury without getting hot. And again, we would expect population density to be higher, partially because we also tend to assume you do most of your agriculture in smaller ancillary stations tethered to the bigger habitat where the gravity might be lower, requiring less structural strength. You also don't need the same levels of radiation shielding and meteor protection that an urban or suburban habitat where people live and children play needs to have. You can cover the outside of a station in solar panels if you want, or mirrors, or just raw shielding. And again, you might use mirrors to bounce in the amount of sunlight you want, and without the more dangerous wavelengths you don't want. Now, would you build one? Yes, but not often. I think that more often folks would go for the stretched ovoid or slightly slanted neocylinder with hemispherical caps. One reason folks often think we'd go spherical is because asteroids are spherical and we could just hollow one out and spin it. But asteroids aren't particularly spherical, especially down at this size range, and you can't spin an asteroid around fast like that. Your typical asteroid 10 miles wide is not even 1% of Earth gravity, where if you dropped a rock from your hand to the floor it would take about a minute to land. Spin that up to 1g and that surface gravity changes to 99.99% of normal Earth gravity, but upwards, not downwards, shredding that rock apart. You'd have to build a whole mesh around it of great tensile strength, and there's no special reason to make that shell a sphere of that radius anyway. It makes just as much sense to drill a cylinder into that asteroid and put a habitat there. Sphere or cylinder, it's rotating inside that asteroid. The asteroid is not rotating, at least not beyond its normal spin, which tends to be an inconvenient value of a couple hours for most asteroids, not a 24-hour day. And you don't just hollow out a 10-mile wide asteroid to get a 10-mile Bernal Sphere. That's the whole point of why rotating habitats beat planets. They are hollow, so use way less mass. If we imagined we wanted 30 meters or 100 feet of ground under us, made of water, rock, dirt, and some strong shell material like steel or graphene, and you end up with a sphere about 170 miles or 270 kilometers wide, not 10, and with an area not of 314 square miles like before, but 87,000 square miles, 224,000 square kilometers, or 55 million acres. The latter, our original Bernal Sphere, is the size of a modest county. This is more like the size of Wyoming or Oregon. Whereas our other Bernal Sphere, 10 miles wide, only needs an asteroid maybe 2 miles wide to build it. And that's a thick shell too. You'll get less radiation coming through that than on Earth, and by a wide margin. 100 feet of armor and rock is pretty attack-proof too. If you want to take something like this out, you need a direct nuclear bomb blast and high yield too, not something low kiloton scale. As we discussed in some of our space warfare episodes, you're never going to get a device as complex as a nuclear bomb that close to anything with a serious point defense system either. Those defenses just can't miss an object that big. As usual, these things are way too expensive for us to build right now by launching material from Earth. So the notion is indeed to source them from asteroids, and even built inside them. Just don't think of us hollowing out a natural asteroid for a single sphere. And as I've mentioned, while Bernal talked about a 10-mile wide sphere that had no gravity and was a bit like a blend of a hollow glass ball and a photosynthetic cell, the usual versions are the smaller ones O'Neill discussed, though as I've also mentioned there are tons of versions. The Kalpana One station we often show is a close cousin to the Bernal Sphere. Babylon 5 from the TV show of that name is an example of one, though you'll hear it called a cylinder too, and visually it resembles both. In this regard, we would probably very rarely see a pure cylinder or sphere. What's more, you probably won't often see a singular version out there. If you just need a small habitat, you go for a ring or a torus, as we discussed in the Stanford Torus episode before. It gets you the necessary level of gravity at a low spin rate without too much material. Your spheres and cylinders are way more efficient in terms of surface area and raw materials per unit of living area though, so you build them when you're building larger communities, and you are generally going to find it more useful to build conglomerations of smaller habitats along with a large mix of different specialized structures, agricultural stations, industrial facilities, low-grav docking ports and shipyards, solar collectors, and so on. And here you might have a sphere encasing all that, to help with space junk and leakage and provide initial defense against radiation, meteor, and attack. Just a huge thin shell around everything else that they float around in a vacuum still, but a less radioactive one, and through which no high-speed junk was moving either. And much as Bernal's original sphere wasn't quite what we picture it as now, with zero gravity inside, this hollow and pressurized sphere with smaller facilities inside it, some pressurized and under spin gravity, might be how spheres end up as home for humanity in the future. Either way, nearly a century after Bernal first suggested the idea, it's running strong, with many new ideas and modifications suggested. And I think it very likely it won't be more than another century before we start seeing them or their cousins getting built.
The Bishop Ring. The Bishop Ring is one of those designs that sits in the gap between familiar space habitats and the truly absurd megastructures. It is much larger than an O'Neill cylinder, several hundred times as big, and around 1,000,000 times bigger than its baby brother, the Stanford Torus, yet still much smaller than a Niven Ringworld or a Banks orbital, and it gives us one of the first designs where the phrase continent-sized habitat is not just a poetic exaggeration. It is named for Forrest Bishop, who explored large rotating ring habitats in the 1990s, in that same broad era that Thomas McKendree was looking at continent-scale cylinders. What made those designs worth revisiting was the discovery and discussion of carbon nanotubes and graphene, materials whose theoretical tensile strength is far beyond steel. We do not need artificial gravity for any of this, and we do not need new physics. We need spin gravity, very strong materials, a lot of mass, and an economy so large that continent-sized space habitat sounds like routine infrastructure rather than utter madness. That may still be a high bar, but this is not a magic bar. If brute force isn't working, you're not using enough of it, and this is a space hab that illustrates that point well. Key thing when it comes to scale, you do not build these in your pioneering days, any more than you build bullet trains, skyscrapers, and 4-lane highways to settle the Oregon Trail. When you need them, you have the industrial might to build them. The basic idea of the Bishop Ring is a vast rotating hoop, wide enough to have land, seas, weather, and a natural atmosphere on its inner surface. Big point there, this is not just a scaled-up version of the Stanford Torus. Small rotating habitats are usually pressure vessels. The air is inside a can, the can is kilometers across and decorated with lakes, forests, and apartments. A Bishop Ring is big enough that air behaves more like a planetary atmosphere. Now, even our pressurized cans, there is a pressure difference based on altitude, but here we see a planet-scale differential. It's thick air near the ground, thinner as you go up, and eventually fades toward vacuum. That is why we often describe it as an open-air habitat. In theory, you're looking at open space, and you could throw a ball or fire a gun directly out into space without hitting anything, other than air. Now, it is not entirely open, of course. You still need enormous rim walls to keep the atmosphere from spilling over the sides, and I think you'd still do some sort of transparent or translucent honeycomb membrane above that to minimize leakage, even though the air has gotten very thin at that point. But at Bishop Ring scale, enormous is relative. On Earth, by the time you're around 30 kilometers, or about 20 miles above sea level, the air pressure is down to around 1% of surface pressure. Go another similar interval higher, and it falls by roughly another factor of 100. So a rim wall tens of kilometers high sounds insane by normal architectural standards, but on a ring hundreds or thousands of kilometers in radius, it's more like the raised edge of a dinner plate. A very large dinner plate, admittedly, and one that would bankrupt every civilization before ours several times over, but still edging. That scale is the big difference. An Island 3 O'Neill cylinder is often imagined as 2 cylinders roughly 4 kilometers in radius and 32 kilometers long, or 20 miles long and 5 miles in diameter, giving each cylinder an internal area about 800 square kilometers. That is immense by space station standards, but not continent size, or county size. Australia is about 7.7 million square kilometers. To get that range of rotating habitat, you either make the cylinder much longer, as we'll see with the Topopolis in a few minutes, or connect lots of habitats together, layer them, or increase their radius dramatically. The Bishop Ring chooses the last option, using much stronger materials to push the radius up to hundreds of kilometers, perhaps on the order of 500 to 1,000 kilometers in more ambitious versions. The reason that takes exotic materials is straightforward. The larger the radius, the higher the rim's tangential speed has to be for Earth-like gravity. The spin rate in revolutions per minute goes down as the structure gets larger, which is good for comfort, but the actual speed of the floor around the circle goes up. A small drum might spin many times per minute but have a rim speed of only a few meters per second. A 1,000-kilometer radius Bishop Ring, providing about 1 G, rotates completely about twice an hour and has a rim speed a bit over 3 kilometers per second, around Mach 9 by aircraft standards. That is very useful if you want to launch objects by letting go at the right time, but also means the structure is constantly trying very hard to become a cloud of extremely expensive shrapnel. That is where carbon nanotubes, graphene, and other advanced composites enter the discussion. Steel works for more modest habitats. Titanium and Kevlar push the range farther. We can go far beyond the scale of the normal Island 3 here, but if you want a true continent-class open ring, you're probably leaning on carbon allotropes or something in that family. Even then, you do not build right up to the theoretical limit. Real materials have flaws, joints, fatigue, radiation damage, micrometeor impacts, manufacturing defects, and managers who swear the cheaper supplier is probably fine. Don't forget all the dirt and water you want to have in there too, so you want safety factors, redundancy, active monitoring, and repair systems. A bishop ring is not just a giant hoop, it is a civilization-scale structural maintenance commitment. The open-air quality gives it some very interesting advantages. Spacecraft could approach along the axis and potentially use the upper atmosphere for aerobraking, spiraling down through the thin air, then docking to a small port on the outer structure. Launching from the rim is attractive too because anything released from the surface already has a velocity of kilometers per second. That does not solve all your orbital mechanics, especially if the ring is embedded in a larger superstructure, but it's an impressive free boost. It turns the habitat into part runway, part launch system, and part world. Lighting also becomes more flexible. Smaller habitat often needs mirrors and windows arranged very carefully, because the whole structure is a pressure vessel and sunlight has to enter without compromising shielding or thermal control. A bishop ring can use large external mirrors, axial light sources, or fusion-powered lamps to simulate a normal day. In a long version, you can have light more along the axis or come in at lower angles through the air, giving dusk and dawn effects with reddened light, not just a dimmer switch labeled evening. You can also tune the wavelengths directly, filtering ultraviolet or adjusting blue light to shape circadian rhythms. At that point, the sky is engineered, but so is every city street, window tint, and greenhouse lamp we already use. The question is whether the result feels like a place people can live, and preferably comfortably. Weather becomes a design problem too. Once the habitat is large enough to hold a real atmosphere, you get clouds, wind, evaporation, rainfall, and climate zones. Now you do have these even smaller habitats, but they are mild and predictable and relatively easy to control. Things change here. You might not want an Earth-like 3-to-1 ocean-to-land ratio, but you do need enough water surface for evaporation, thermal buffering, and ecological stability. You can cheat by using shallow seas, chains of lakes, active evaporation systems, and managed circulation, like bouncing more light in and concentrated beams to help with evaporation on open empty sea. But the larger the ring gets, the more you can let ordinary fluid dynamics do the work. That is one of the reasons bigger habitats are tempting. They're not merely more spacious, they become more forgiving and more natural in their internal behavior. But they are also riskier. We should never assume that the biggest buildable habitat is the best habitat to build. If you have enough material and labor to build one bishop ring, you might also have enough to build a vast swarm of smaller habitats with the same total living area. The smaller habitats are easier to quarantine, repair, evacuate, specialize, upgrade, and politically diversify. One invasive species, one bad software update, one structural defect, or one civil conflict is less catastrophic when it's spread across many separate habitats rather than concentrated on one artificial continent. That's why I tend to see bishop rings as something a mature space civilization builds when it wants open landscapes, large ecologies, and prestige, not necessarily when it wants the cheapest square meter of living area. An O'Neill cylinder, especially when built out of more modern materials, can act as an excellent nature preserve, but might not be quite big enough for some species, like elephants, to have a big population in a natural environment. The bishop ring then is the sort of habitat you build when you already know how to build me smaller habitats, and now you want a place with inland seas, cloud banks, long horizons, and maps that feel planetary again. So the bishop ring is not the first habitat we build, and certainly not the most common. They probably have clouds of smaller torus and cylinder habitats drifting around them like suburbs. It is one of the first designs where a space habitat begins to feel less like a station, less like a city or a county, and more like artificial geography. A routine ring hundreds of kilometers wide, with rim walls taller than mountains and possibly stylized to look like them, air thinning into a vacuum above it, and a surface racing around at several kilometers per second, all so people can stand on its interface and watch the weather roll across a continent that did not exist until someone decided to build one.
In the ancient past, civilization arose around long rivers that took weeks to travel down. But in the future, we might build civilizations around rivers that were billions of miles long. Ancient Egypt is a fascinating period and place in human history, covering a vast stretch of time and containing immense structures like the pyramids. And yet as big as the modern nation of Egypt looks on a map, and often might have on an ancient map too, it was a region of civilization almost entirely dominated by the Nile River, and as a result was a skinny realm 500 miles long but only 5 miles wide. it is not alone in that regard either. We see that with other rivers or coastlines, and indeed even with modern roads and freeways in the US, where people will often feel like they're driving by endless houses and commercial centers in some eternal suburban sprawl, without realizing that 1,000 feet from that road, the buildings and concrete and landscaping shift into miles of forest or swamp. In today's Nebula exclusive, we're going to be exploring the Topopolis megastructure, one of the biggest buildable under known science and technology, and which has an interesting feature in that it can only be so wide in diameter, but can be any length you wish, indeed billions of miles long if you desire. As a result, you get these long thin habitats, and it would seem almost inevitable you would be running a long river down that body, and roads too of course, and we want to explore that today. Let's begin by explaining why it has those limitations and an open-ended nature. First, the fundamental purpose of a rotating space habitat is to be a ring, torus, or cylinder that emulates gravity by spinning around. We've discussed this a lot on the channel, so we'll keep this abridged, but centrifugal force, especially in large spinning habitats, is effectively identical to gravity. You're not just pinned to the walls or floor like some garment in the spin cycle of your washer. If you jump up, you will come right back down. And this centrifugal force is the same thing making astronauts weightless in space, since our space station is just a couple hundred miles off the ground and gravity is barely diminished there, about 90% of Earth normal. Note that astronauts there remain weightless whether touching the station or floating, and on a spin-gravity habitat the same remains true, only reverse. You keep the simulated gravity whether you're touching the spinning structure or not. Indeed, this is why objects further from Earth orbit at slower speeds. They experience less gravity there, and thus don't need as much centrifugal force to counteract that gravity and keep from falling. Being in a wider orbit requires less speed and centrifugal force, which is handy. Unfortunately for spin-gravity habitats, that works against us. Centrifugal force is based on the mass of the object spinning around, times the square of the velocity is whirling around at, and divided by its radius. And by default in a rotating habitat, we want the force to be equal to normal Earth gravity, 9.8 meters per second, or 32 feet per second. That means that if I want to build a habitat twice as wide, but with the same force or gravity, I need its tangential velocity or rim speed to be the square root of 2 higher. Thrice as wide, the square root of 3, 4 times wider, twice the velocity, 9 times wider, thrice the velocity, and so on. The force on that rim, or the outer hull of the habitat, is rising as we make it bigger. More area, more force. But the width of the rim doesn't really matter any more than having 2 rotating rings right next to each other would, or 2 bike tires spinning near each other would, or for that matter a suspension bridge on Earth which is limited by its length rather than how many lanes of traffic it is wide. It's the circumference of the structure that is adding strain and requiring more tensile force, and you may think of it as a suspension bridge hanging on Earth with a length equal to that circumference, like you cut the ring and laid it out as a long straight bridge on Earth. Fundamentally, any rotating ring or cylinder habitat is structurally the same as building a habitat on a very large and wide suspension bridge on Earth, and thus building a city on a long skinny bridge spanning a very wide gulf is a lot harder and requires a much stronger material than one running down a long but skinny chasm, as if you threw a tarp over the Grand Canyon and built a city on it. From this you would probably conclude we can only build rotating habitats maybe a mile in circumference, but in space there's no wind, floods, or earthquakes rocking, shaking, shoving, or eroding our habitat's exterior, so we can push material limits a lot more, and use even mundane steel or carbon fiber to build a habitat several miles or kilometers in radius that would have tons of dirt and water over every square meter. This is the O'Neill cylinder I so often discuss in our show, or the Island 3 design, 5 miles or 8 kilometers in diameter and 20 miles or 32 kilometers long. And that includes plenty of leeway on the engineering side already, though the design is 50 years old, and if it were built with modern materials would be able to be decently larger. Or you could keep it at 5-mile diameter and go heavier on internal landscaping and redundancy. Whichever the case, I've a fondness for ancient history too, and remember listening to an audiobook on ancient Egypt some years back, where it was describing that land as essentially a civilization 500 miles long but only 5 wide, where that similarity to an O'Neill cylinder struck me, and I've never been able to think of a Topopolis since then without thinking of very long river civilizations. Although amusingly, I tend to think of them in my own head as more in the era of the steamboat or in Louisiana on the Mississippi River, which might have been influenced by both Ian M. Banks' novel Consider Phlebas or the Ravenloft game setting. Whatever the case, if your materials allowed it, you might build that habitat a good deal wider, potentially hundreds of miles wide with something like the McKendree Cylinder, but you still hit the limit. Not in length though, and here's the neat thing about them that gets them the nickname of being a spaghetti habitat from some, or why I sometimes compare them to balls of yarn. Any material, no matter how strong, can be bent and tied in knots just fine at a large enough scale. This is why you can use giant steel cables just like rope, though it's easier if it's in strands. Fundamentally, even a rotating habitat, if long enough, could be wrapped around in loops, which means we could loop one around the entire orbit of a star out at Earth or Mars distance and get a hoop 1 billion miles long, 5 or 50 miles wide, and spinning on its axis just fine. But this is the other aspect about rotating habitats folks often miss due to artistic license. We did contemplate putting big windows into things to let natural sunlight in for a lot of earlier designs, and indeed with modern materials those could be as strong as steel, but we usually imagine lighting them from the central axis by artificially generated sunlight nowadays, even if that sunlight might be powered by solar panels outside. As such, we can stick our rotating ring or cylinder inside another thicker, tougher, and vastly cheaper ring or cylinder that was counterspinning much more slowly or not at all, the sheath or superstructure of the habitat. Or for the Topopolis, picture a long wire, conductive metal with a long protective jacket around it, only in this case the metal wire inside is hollow and rotating, probably on bearings or magnetic levitation. And just as you can still loop or twist a hose while it has water going through it, so long as you don't kink it, this habitat can be bent quite a lot and still rotate. And if it is inside a non-rotating sheath like a wire, then we could spool it up like we would a wire spool or like yarn in a big ball. Now you would not want to be making this a big sphere all the way through for heat issues. We usually would imagine wrapping this around an asteroid maybe, or a hoop around a red dwarf, or maybe several winds around that star, giving you a continuous long but skinny habitat hundreds, thousands, or millions of miles long. But you could wrap it a few layers thick into a spherical shell around a star like ours, or bigger, and make a Dyson shell this way that was one long, skinny habitat 5 miles in diameter and several quadrillion miles long, or for a more astronomical context, 1,000 light years long. And you could build something like this as one long line from one star to another, or even between two galaxies if you wanted to. You'd presumably be needing to have segments constantly being added along the way, as the distance between astronomical objects does change, but that might not be very hard if you were just weaving in a new skinny ring segment, maybe a centimeter across, once a decade every few kilometers, making it no more disruptive than continental drift is, but minus the earthquakes. And you might use this approach even on a much more plausible Topopolis, like one being grown out of an asteroid to wrap around it, or perhaps out of a rocky moon around some ice giant it orbited, as you grew it with the expanding needs of local communities in mind, as an alternative to just adding another whole island 3-size segment at one of the ends. Here, every parcel of land slowly grows with time. And of course this can be done as sausage links or chain links instead of as a thread, and internally you might drop a mountain range every 100 miles as a natural border and a place you can stick an air wall or emergency bulkhead that can slam down. Though a circular mountain range at the cap of a cylinder segment might look like the voracious teeth of some circle-mouthed predator. Since it is a rotating habitat built in space, you would expect main transport to be by vacuum train in the outer hull, and we have an episode on vacuum trains coming out at the end of February 2024. And if it is all bundled up like a ball of yarn, you can just have coiled segments crisscrossing that the train could cut through. Something about these structures always makes us think to have a primitive civilization inside one, My good friend and best-selling author Dennis E. Taylor did that in his own novel Heaven's River, which is set in a Topopolis, and I did help advise on the structure there, but it already featured a long river and a primitive civilization before I was involved in the project. Great minds think alike maybe, or dream the same dreams, but there is something compelling about them as a quasi-fantasy setting. And indeed, if inside such a place, a train that was able to move between two segments might not just seem fast to those using it, but like it was teleporting, since if we're imagining a map of this place as some big long book of segment after adjoining skinny segment, a point of crisscross might move you from segment 2 to 345, or page 345 on that map. Now, 5 miles wide is an arbitrary figure and an inaccurate one too, because a tube 5 miles in diameter has a circumference of 5 pi, or 15.71 miles, or 25.28 kilometers. I would guess any civilization developing units and measures inside one of these would use their circumference or even intervals of it as their unit of measure, and probably refer to circles as having diameter equal to the circumference divided by pi, rather than as we would usually say it, the diameter times pi, simply from that different perspective of living inside the circumference. We also might imagine our own builders use something decently stronger than steel for their ground, and that resulted in a circumference of an even 50 miles. Let's say for the sake of design, we built one of these as a big single hoop around Saturn, thus we only need one river rather than a second one pumping water back the other way, or some additional tubing doing that. So we run a small, mostly hollow and steep mountain range opposite the river, and put out artificial lighting or fake suns at its various peaks, and everyone uses that mountain range as a page edge on maps with the river down the middle, itself a mile wide at some points and very slow, and not straight, any more than the mountains, as we can curve it around so as not to be boring. We'll say this Topopolis got built out at the Maxwell Gap in Saturn's rings, meaning the hoop of our Maxwell Topopolis was 87,500 kilometers in radius, or 550,000 kilometers in hoop circumference or Topopolis length, or 342,000 miles. If we then portion the whole thing into big square counties, 50 miles or 80 kilometers long too, then you end up with just under 70,000 of them, each the size of Delaware. Though there's nothing stopping some region being the size of Texas, it's just now a river valley running between some mountains 5,400 miles long. And we could easily imagine a civilization running itself just fine at such a length, even a lower tech one than nowadays. Indeed, that's almost exactly half the width and twice the length of Chile. And there's no big neighbors off the side pressuring things, just your neighbors up or down the river, though you could have realms popping up on either side of the river. The whole construct has roughly a tenth the internal area of Earth, though probably at a much higher percentage of land to water, so it would only need to coil around Saturn maybe 3 or 4 times to have an Earth level of land area with a nice mix of lakes and small rivers inside the Topopolis, feeding that massive river over 1,000,000 miles long. Depending on how thick you want your land and shell, you might end up using a whole moon of Saturn to build it, one of the larger ones too, not Titan but maybe Mimas or Tethys. You could add hundreds of more loops by using Titan, maybe even a few thousand. We could even imagine building one right along the moon's orbit around Earth, and at the diameter we discussed, every loop of this Topopolis is giving you an extra Earth's worth of living area. And its outer hull is essentially an orbital ring and launch loop capable of hurling ships out fuel-free at very high speeds, making it not just a big living area but a powerful interplanetary trade hub. Now, back on our Maxwell Topopolis, we might try to imagine a nation a third of 1,000,000 miles long trying to operate without advanced technology, though we should emphasize that there is no reason why they should be, given that they live inside a massive artificial construct. You might plausibly be moving ships down that river at 10 miles per hour day and night, so some province 100,000 miles away facing a rebellion might get reinforcements in 10,000 hours, which is about a year, and honestly would not be nearly the logistical hassle such a distance would normally imply. But in antiquity, some bigger empires did take many months or even a year to move troops around to hotspots. Higher speeds are quite plausible, and the long thin stretch is ideal for operations like mail services, pony express equivalents, messenger stables and inns for switching out fresh horses, and semaphore beacon towers signaling messages with flags on fire. The land itself would seem to favor smaller realms, being long and skinny, but the nature of that land, with the huge passageway, really favors trade and flow of goods and ideas. It's probably insanely fertile land too. Those ancient fertile river valley kingdoms churned out food, and often had population densities only seen away from them in modern times with modern agriculture, but almost all that growing took place close to that river. It's almost unimaginable how much cargo a low-tech civilization could be moving this way, and the whole length is a continuous Nile River or Silk Road when it comes to trade. So it is a strong pump for culture to flow down, and makes a plausible case you might end up with a common trade language down the whole thing. All at the same time, the sheer immensity of scale means someone might begin their life on one part of Maxwell and walk or take a boat for a few hours each day, cover 10 or 20 miles, stop in a new town for an evening to enjoy and learn about it, and it would take a whole lifetime to make that journey. One loop of Maxwell done at 20 miles a day would take you 52 years to complete. And even if your technology allows more, there'd be no real reason to travel faster for personal exploration. And Maxwell is a small Topopolis. Again, we could imagine one made of graphene as wide as any continent, or one that wrapped repeatedly around our own asteroid belt, billions of miles long, or both. And on a place like this, you might have millions of cultures going through thousands of different epochs at any given time. And there are easier ways to combine a lot of living area if you're not fixated on one contiguous chunk of land you can walk, swim, or fly to, so a Topopolis might be favored by those hoping for a more primitivist or vintage civilization. It is interesting contemplating what civilizations on this river might be like too, since there's so many things pushing for both stability and against stability. Every kingdom basically only has two borders, up and down river, and those borders never get bigger as your kingdom does since the width never changes, while on a normal 2D surface, your borders get wider as your empire does, twice the width, twice the border to guard. And in 3 dimensions, your imperial blob has surfaces not lines for borders, and those rising with the square of your width. In all of those cases, more size means more land in your realm to supply your forces, but your battlefront never rises inside a Topopolis, it merely deepens in terms of how far you need to move troops and supplies, and how large an area you must recruit those troops and draw those supplies from. But it would seem to really favor big defensive bastions, and even more so if you had built a lot of narrow intervals along the way to serve as pressure locks against a breach in a segment, which also allows weather control too. Folks trying to dam or alter that river might be a common cause of war too, and maybe the kind that brought troops in from places so far away you didn't have regular contact with them. Speaking of ways to alter the weather, like raising and dimming light levels along the way, or slightly widening or narrowing the cylinder, I should note that we have some limited options for branching these structures off. It isn't like a water hose or river where you can just have them meet and split. You basically must widen the segment, which either means lower gravity there or a choppy water environment where smaller ring segments are slowly widening and gaining speed. Then they must match to 2 or more skinnier segments, which themselves would have the same spin rates and gravities. It is a lot easier to do with a water surface instead of land, and thus would have the tributary river look to them, and this really needs to be done inside a wider stationary superstructure, at least for that chunk of it. This is a lot easier if you limit your land bridges to moving down the low-gravity central axis for those splits too. That same approach of widening narrow segments allows you to transit from the inner spinning ring to a stationary superstructure by having a place it widens and where we basically get a staircase of wider ring segments each meeting at a modest velocity difference. Our typical 5-mile wide O'Neill cylinder rotates at 200 meters per second or 440 miles per hour, while our Maxwell Topopolis spins at nearly twice that speed, and some ring staircase of platforms meeting at a speed difference of just 1 mile per hour would be comfortable as steps for us to walk, or as angled platforms with ramps for lips that wheeled vehicles could go down, hundreds of them in a line, possibly more to have an even slower rate. Those might turn and swing backwards like a staircase in a mini-storied building down, or be one big long line. This could be made into some sort of landscape or into a river or two. It would seem like a lot of extra effort, but given how much goes into the entire structure to begin with, it might be well within the region of a minor cost gladly incurred for the aesthetics and theme. Though you're also descending to a place with no gravity, or a superstructure spinning maybe just fast enough to give a moon-like low-gravity feeling of there being an actual up and down. This is the main reason why a vacuum train on the superstructure would not have an entrance from every house, whereas normally on a basic rotating habitat with a few meters of hull and dirt between the air and the vacuum outside, every house's basement probably has an airlock to space where they keep their personal spaceship or their pod for getting on the vacuum train line. Once you start wrapping segments of a Topopolis around each other, you must start having your travel and communication lines in that superstructure if you want to take advantage of points of intersection and crisscross. It's an interesting question in the end because any O'Neill cylinder or rotating habitat could be slowly grown in length to become a Topopolis, and I think folks would like the features that let them just keep walking or sailing or flying along without segment breaks. So I think the Topopolis will be fairly common in the future, even if I wouldn't expect many to aim for Dysonian scale just because they can. It is hard to imagine any at that scale losing their technology for the same reason it doesn't work on a Niven-style ring world. You've got technology all over the place to use as examples and to recycle for parts, and you've got a million times the living area all connected, and probably built without pointless wide and non-traversable seas and deserts, in favor of being mostly the sort of land people like to live on. That means if somehow a civilization did go low-tech after some unknown disaster, they have a million times the people, all interconnected, with examples of higher tech all over the place. Restoration and research should move fairly quickly. So good for stories, but not for realistic scenarios. On the other hand, if your typical Topopolis is more modest, something smaller than even Maxwell, which was hardly tiny, then yes, you could have one built with techno-primitivism in mind, or small enough that a recovery was still taking place in a world that, however long, had no more living area than a large state. It's probably still a prime living area with way more fertility and population than we expect a big block of a country to have, but it gets a lot more feasible. It could factionalize into a lot of little kingdoms. Some of these might trade and travel freely, while every dozen or so might be blocked from where the local kingdom just stuck walls and defenses up to not permit trade or travel through, except maybe folks who snuck around some natural barrier like a mountain or scuba dived under a seawall. They certainly seem like great places for stories. Higher tech or lower tech, these things are constructible with no new science, so I think we will see them in the future, where they may be the settings for much of humanity's own continuing story too. But that wraps up our story for today.
The McKendree Cylinder. The McKendree Cylinder is the giant cousins of the O'Neill Cylinder and the cylinder counterpart of the Bishop Ring. Both belong to the Continent-class habitat family, which we did an episode on way back in 2020, but they saw the geometry differently. The Bishop Ring opens the cylinder into a vast hoop with rim walls and open atmosphere. The McKendree keeps the basic cylinder layout with land along the inner wall, but scales the radius up until the habitat is no longer county-sized but continent-sized. A standard Island 3 O'Neill cylinder is already enormous, about 4 kilometers in radius and 32 kilometers long. One cylinder has around 800 square kilometers of inner surface area, while the paired version we have in sight is about 1,300 square kilometers or 500 square miles. You can scale it up to be at least twice as wide using modern materials, and as we just saw in Topopolis, you can go longer. But the McKendree cylinder takes the same basic concept and pushes the diameter toward roughly 1,800 miles, or nearly 3,000 kilometers, assuming graphene-class materials and similar safety margins. That gives a radius around 1,500 kilometers and a circumference around 9,400 kilometers. Every kilometer of that length adds about 9,400 square kilometers of living area. That's the area of Puerto Rico, Lebanon, or Connecticut. So McKendree, only 100 kilometers long, already has close to 1 million square kilometers of internal surface area. Think Egypt or Ontario. At 250 kilometers, it's as big as India. At 350 kilometers, a couple hundred miles, it's as big as the whole EU. And at 600 miles or 1,000 kilometers long, has about 9.4 million square kilometers, very nearly as big as the whole US, including Alaska. If scaled to Island 3 proportions, about 8 times as long as it is wide, it would be around 24,000 kilometers long, and about 225 million square kilometers of internal surface area, approaching half of the Earth's total surface area, land and ocean combined, and bigger than Mars. That is an illustrative upper-end figure, not a starter model. Real materials have defects, joints, fatigue, radiation damage, micrometeor impacts, and all the other reasons engineers develop that haunted look. But it shows why McKendrees matter. They are not just big habitats, a way to get planetary-scale geography without using planetary-scale mass. Start using hollow mountains and dips and curves to represent mountain ranges, for instance. The main new feature, compared to the Bishop Ring, is layering. A McKendree is not an open-air environment because it's too long to let in light without extreme use of mirrors. But if you're going artificial lighting, you can open the door to layering. Picture something that is less one hollow cylinder and more of a set of nested cylinders, what I sometimes call a Matryoshka McKendree. On a smaller habitat, that gets awkward fast. Move inward by a few kilometers and gravity changes too much, or you need separate layers spinning at different rates, which gives you air friction, transfer, and bearing problems. But in a cylinder with a radius of 1,000 or 1,500 kilometers, a layer 10 kilometers inward only has about 1% lower gravity if it shares the same spin rate, and at that altitude your atmosphere is thinned down a lot, minimizing friction. Go a bit higher and you can ignore friction, which also means you can alter your spin rate up a bit to restore higher gravity. These layers still need to be airtight though, as you get air piling up on one layer at the bottom, not each having its own altitude varying atmosphere or atmocylinder. And if I haven't mentioned that elsewhere in the anthology already, while they are not atmospheres, being not the least bit spherical, we still stick with atmosphere over atmo-ring or atmocylinder to avoid confusion. Anyway, isolation is not a bad thing, as that lower layer can add shielding to the layer above it, and so on, where several separate cylinders need more mass, and your limit here is mostly heat dissipation. But by sheer scale, that means you could have an outer Earth-like landscape, then inner agricultural cylinders, reservoir cylinders, industrial cylinders, low-gravity recreation zones, or entire specialized ecologies. One layer might be mostly ocean, one might be forest, one might be dry grassland or farmland. A bottom ocean layer makes a lot of sense, but you could also reserve some of those outer layers for lower shielding agricultural use, since crops do not need the same radiation standards as families, schools, and hospitals. And you could let your sonar get a little bit wider still by letting those most outer layers have lower gravity, as they also need lower shielding too, if you're using them for lower shielding agricultural use anyway. And their shielding will stack with the inner layers to help better protect those inner layers with habitats for people in them. Again, heat becomes the limiting issue. Every layer needs light, and every layer turns some of that light into waste heat. We will deep dive that more in the habitat cluster and conglomeration segment, but in short form, stack too many illuminated biospheres inside of one another, and you have not built a paradise, you built a thermos bottle with zoning disputes. So a practical McKendree probably uses nesting selectively, with large gaps, radiators, light pipes, mirrors, and industrial voids rather than endless packed decks. It also gives you more room for true planetary scale environmental engineering. A normal linear cylinder can have lakes and local weather. A McKendree can have inland seas, massive river basins, mountain ranges that shape climate, and animal ranges large enough for megafauna. 10 kilometers of altitude on a 1,500 kilometer radius habitat changes gravity by less than 1%, so the atmosphere and landscape behave far more like a planet than a small spinning drum. Near the upper end, the line between McKendree Cylinder and Topopolis can also blur. A Topopolis is defined by length, not by being narrow. So if you stretched a McKendree-class cylinder into a planetary ring, a stellar loop, or a coiled ball of yarn habitat, it would still be a Topopolis. It would just be a McKendree diameter Topopolis, which is the sort of phrase that makes the coolness factor and structural engineering headaches rise together. So the McKendree is probably not the cheapest or most common habitat. Smaller cylinders are easier to build, quarantine, repair, and specialize. But the Island 3 is a county in space, McKendree Cylinder is a continent rolled into a sky. A rotating world with enough scale for rivers, weather, nations, ecologies, and histories to unfold inside a single engineered shell. Now that we've reached the heights of tensile engineering and scope, let's go back to the practicality of early tether halves and contemplate building hammer habitats into spaceships, or asking what tethered habitats might look like using the tensile strength of the McKendree Cylinder.
From hammer habitats to tethered designs, today we explore the ingenious ways to bring some gravitas to the final frontier. Over the last few months, we've been deep diving into various types of rotating space habitats designed to provide spin gravity to their occupants, ideally allowing families, communities, and even entire ecosystems to dwell in space. Since we recently explored how centrifugal force simulates gravity, we won't repeat that here. However, today's habitat design closely resembles the classic human centrifuges used to acclimate pilots and astronauts to high G-forces. These centrifuges are designed for one person at a time, whereas hammer habitats aim to achieve something similar on a larger scale. Space habitats like the O'Neill Cylinder, von Braun Wheel, Stanford Torus, and Bernal Sphere all aim to provide spin gravity for large populations and expansive areas. In contrast, tethered habitats and hammer habitats are about achieving the minimum structural requirements to provide gravity for a crew or a living space. As we will see today, these designs can scale to very large structures and offer practical modularity, potentially making them the most common type of space habitat, particularly aboard spacecraft or mobile facilities. But why focus on these designs? We don't yet know the limits of human or ecological tolerance for gravity variance and rotation rates. However, we have reason to believe that 2 rotations per minute, RPM, is probably acceptable, though 1 RPM is often preferred as a safety margin. Speeds beyond this can become uncomfortable. To illustrate, you can test your tolerance by sitting on a swivel chair and rotating steadily at a rate of about 1 rotation every 6 seconds, 10 RPM. While some people might tolerate this, others may feel discomfort, and prolonged exposure, such as living in such conditions for months, would likely exacerbate these effects. Medications might help, but are not an ideal solution for long-term habitation. If we translate these spin rates into dimensions of spin gravity habitats simulating Earth gravity, the diameter of the ring or cylinder becomes a critical factor. At 1 RPM, the required diameter is approximately 1,789 meters, or 5,870 feet, just over a mile. At 2 RPM, it decreases to 447 meters, or 1,466 feet, a bit over a quarter mile. At 10 RPM, it shrinks dramatically to 17.9 meters, or 59 feet, a hundredth the size of the 1 RPM habitat. For a given level of gravity, the radius, diameter, and circumference of a rotating habitat are all inversely proportional to the square of the rotational rate. This means that having the rotation rate requires a structure 4 times larger. Reducing it to a tenth demands a structure 10 squared or 100 times the size. Each of these scenarios requires significant structural material, particularly for long-duration missions like trips to Mars or asteroid expeditions, where you need a lot of radiation shielding. Providing gravity to maintain crew health during such voyages remains a critical challenge. If it turns out that 1 RPM is the minimum tolerable rotation rate for both the crew and any biological organisms or ecosystems they bring on board, then we must build accordingly. One option is to construct a wide ring over a mile in diameter and 3.5 miles in circumference, roughly 6 kilometers of tunnel lined with radiation shielding, presumably wide enough for crew compartments. Such a structure would be enormously expensive. We won't bother to estimate the cost in today's dollars, as it's hard to imagine anyone requesting, let alone approving, such an expenditure. A more practical alternative is to use a tethered system. In this setup, a pod is connected to the spaceship by a strong tether and reeled out to provide the necessary radius for spin gravity. This tether could be made from advanced materials like graphene superlaminate, which is strong enough to support space elevators. Even a cord thinner than yarn could hold hundreds of tons of habitat suspended in normal gravity. In this case, the pod is essentially a spinning module connected to the main body of the ship, which probably spins at the same rate but far lower spin gravity, allowing the crew to experience artificial gravity without requiring a massive structural ring. To enhance safety and functionality, the walls and floors of the module could be filled with compressed gas, serving 3 purposes: air reserves, to provide breathable air for the crew; radiation shielding, to protect against cosmic rays and solar radiation; emergency propellant. If the tether snaps, The compressed gas can act as a quick propellant to slow the module to a relative stop with the ship. Water reservoirs might also serve in these roles. While compressed gas isn't the most efficient propellant, it could be sufficient for the relative speeds involved. For 1 RPM and 2 RPM habitats, these speeds are approximately 94 and 47 meters per second, or 209 and 105 miles per hour, respectively. The ship would certainly carry enough spare fuel and Delta V to rendezvous with a module that broke free, given the vastly greater amounts of fuel required for interplanetary travel and maneuvers upon arrival. The primary safety system would involve multiple tethers to reduce the risk of detachment. Additionally, both the ship and the module could be equipped with grappling mechanisms that automatically deploy and magnetically latch onto the other, allowing for easy reattachment and retrieval. Another potential feature is a thin-walled, pressurized sleeve connecting the module and the main ship. This sleeve could telescope outward, enabling crew members to drift or climb between the two without requiring a spacesuit. A retractable system like this would also allow the module to be reeled back in, offering flexibility as usage. For example, the crew could sleep in the module while it's deployed at full gravity. You might have them doing daily operations in zero gravity, or having a command module at, say, half gravity reeled out half as far. If you need more modules, the cost rises linearly, because you just add another module and another tether. Double your space, double your cost. During planetary maneuvers, the module would be reeled in tightly, locked in place, and secured before proceeding. Ideally, the main ship should be significantly more massive than the modules. Otherwise, reeling in the modules could cause the main ship to spin faster, similar to how an ice skater adjusts their spin speed by extending or pulling in their arms. Although maybe you want that, as the spinning halves could serve as a sort of flywheel battery. Slowing them down as they winch in recharges your capacitors just in time for you to light your engines, or before a battle. Tethered habitats offer a remarkably scalable and modular approach to creating spin gravity. Unlike rigid structures, which demand significant upfront investment in materials and construction, tethered modules can be added or removed as needed, offering flexibility for different mission profiles. This adaptability is crucial for interplanetary missions, where crew size, mission objectives, and payload requirements can vary significantly. You might have a single bedroom-sized module or several interconnected ones. If desired, an entire ring of such modules could be deployed, with airlocks between them to allow people to move freely from one to another. Now imagine an interplanetary ferry, similar to the Aldrin cycler we often discuss. In this concept, a primary spaceship serves as a central hub, with a smaller spacecraft latching onto it via tethers. These tethers could supply communications, electricity, air, water, and even refueling, all while spinning to generate artificial gravity. Entire constellations of small personal spacecraft could attach themselves to a larger vessel, forming a mobile, interconnected community. Similarly, a large space hub could function as the downtown of a space-based community. Individuals or families might tether their personal dwellings to this hub, receiving gravity and utilities like power and water, not unlike a space-age recreational vehicle camp or park in some ways. If they decide to move, assuming their dwelling isn't a spaceship, they could hire a tug to transport them to another hub that better suits their needs or preferences. One could also imagine a sort of support vessel, the sole purpose of which is to be the hub by deploying trusses or cables. This could even store additional fuel, supplies, or cargo at its center, or maybe an even smaller skiff-like drone that deploys from your vessel to link up to another. Or, why not, even no hub at all, just two smaller vessels linking cables to each other's bows to rotate around an empty axis, like a bolus in this Ebola habitat or Bola Hab. These ships are unlikely to undergo any sort of thrust stronger than what an ion drive could provide. This is meant for the long cruise to your destination, so you could get pretty creative with the combinations. We also have a stronger variation of the tether concept, the hammer habitat. This design assumes a larger module connected by something more rigid, resembling a shaft rather than a flexible tether, hence the name. A more accurate term might be twin hammer habitat, since these are typically built in pairs, and like the Bola Hab, does not necessarily need a hub. While you could construct 3 or 4 such modules, at a certain point, the configuration starts to resemble a ring. In fact, you could keep adding hammerhead modules until they form a complete ring. Or several. These modules could also be removable, similar to the tethered concept, allowing people to attach their habitats to open spaces or a central structure. If we think of this design as an analogy to an apartment complex or housing development, the ring could act as a central corridor with the individual hammer habitat modules branching off from it. However, I tend to imagine hammer habitats as smaller systems, intended for stations housing a few hundred people or less. These setups could still be retractable, but likely in a set-up-the-tent way, where the components are packed for transport and then manually assembled at the destination, rather than a simple push-the-button deployment. Why only a few hundred people? The size limit is not entirely arbitrary. While we often assume space development will heavily rely on robotics, there is a practical limit to how much autonomy and decision-making we want to delegate to machines. Human oversight is likely to remain critical. Human-machine teaming generally produces better results than either working alone, unless of course we allow ourselves to be replaced by smarter-than-human AI. That scenario is unlikely, as creating AI with human-level intelligence would erode humanity's unique niche, and with billions of intelligent humans already available, it's doubtful anyone would advocate for such a policy, though there's always a Skynet scenario. Humans need a purpose anyway, so you might as well use them to get stuff done, not just robots. Humans need more than purpose to thrive though, they also need a community. Even for those who are comfortable with extended solitude, such as myself, there is a limit. I can go several days without human interaction, but I still get stir-crazy. Space missions go a lot longer than that. While I once lived alone and enjoyed it at the time, I would not recommend it to anyone nowadays, especially for long-term arrangements. Even for people with active social lives or workplaces, living alone, in my opinion, is not optimal. We can certainly imagine spaceships and remote stations with a lone hermit aboard. While I may think such isolation is unhealthy, there will always be individuals who disagree and choose to live that way, and probably lots of opportunities for them to do so. Our interest lies not just in how small habitats might be, but also in how large. Many operations, however, would have little need to support more than a few hundred people. This number is roughly double Dunbar's number, a theoretical limit to the number of stable social relationships one person can maintain, typically cited as about 150 to 160. This population size also aligns with many historic communities that functioned effectively on a social and practical level. With a few hundred people, you'd have room for multiple social circles, a larger dating pool, children with peers their age, enough participants for sports teams, and sufficient diversity for specialized roles such as doctors, lawyers, and engineers. In highly automated environments, such as asteroid mines, where few workers are needed and additional personnel might be counterproductive, a community of this size might be ideal. In fact, in many cases, we'd likely see much smaller habitats. Though I would not be surprised if laws, regulations, incentives, or even habitat insurance premiums required minimum populations and result in a lot of additional local cottage industry to keep those folks employed. While most of humanity may eventually reside in larger habitats or on planets, the majority of individual habitats will almost certainly be smaller ones, much like the countless minor planets and asteroids in our solar system, which together don't add up to the mass of a single major planet. All the planets combined, both major and minor, still fall short of matching Jupiter's immense mass. Habitats might work out the same. One big cylinder habitat has 1 million people, and its nearest neighbors are a few hundred smaller hammer habitats with a few hundred people each, amounting to just 1% of that cylinder's population. How small can they be? The size of a habitat depends largely on how affordable it is to construct relative to the available resources and technology. In an advanced, post-scarcity civilization, we could imagine a scenario where every individual has their own O'Neill cylinder, fully built and maintained by automated systems. If we consider something more aligned with modern expectations of living space and use a 1 RPM ring habitat, it would have a radius of 894 meters and a circumference of 5,615 meters. Dividing that ring into segments for 300 people would give each person approximately 18.7 meters, 61 feet of ring length. This segment could be as wide and deep as desired. For example, if the width matched the length and included multiple levels, it might provide around 1,000 square meters, 10,000 square feet, per person, not per household. Such a design would still be modest for a Stanford Torus. However, for a smaller scale application, like a crew of 30 workers at an asteroid mine, this would be vastly excessive. In that case, you need only 10% of the space in the previous example, or far less since the prior example was quite lavish, and making the ring narrower does not solve the problem. Ring habitats already come with significant mass penalties compared to cylinder habitats for the same living area, and reducing the size would only exacerbate this problem. Instead, a hammer habitat would be far more practical. If your community or company later decides more space is necessary, they can simply send additional modules with tethers or shafts that can be unpacked and connected. Beyond that, you're not limited to a single rotation ring. You could add additional axes of rotation, creating multiple rings as the habitat grows to meet demand. You can also expand an individual module by attaching smaller additions to any of its 4 sides, or even above and below it. This might shift the design from the hammer-like appearance to more of a wedge-shaped module, creating a configuration that resembles pie slices rather than twirling hammers. The upper areas, being under lower gravity, would add weight but could be highly practical, especially for storing bulky equipment. A little gravity often makes maintenance and operation easier compared to zero gravity. For instance, your ground transports for Mars might be stored in a bay above the living area, where the lower gravity facilitates easier maintenance. Zero gravity, on the other hand, complicates tasks like changing the oil or performing other mechanical work. This approach balances functionality with a practicality in design. It also gives you some place to get used to lower gravity during the trip. Needless to say, if you are contemplating more confined spaces per person or smaller crews, like a trip to Mars the next couple of decades, the hammer hab or tethered habitat module approach works even better. This concept isn't limited to living modules. You can also have dedicated agricultural modules that are mostly automated and therefore do not require the extensive shielding needed for human-centric habitats. Additionally, this approach mitigates many safety concerns. A compromised module is far less catastrophic than a breach in the side of an O'Neill cylinder habitat. If you have a smaller space station that needs more dangerous areas like manufacturing or chemical fuel synthesis, or a custom section for visitors to process through, it makes isolation easier. It also opens the door to modules built and launched from Earth initially, then bigger and more standardized ones made at specialized production facilities in space and shipped out to places needing more space. I tend to think that in the longer term, people will prefer more personal space, so the thresholds for switching to larger structures like rings or cylinders might be much lower as populations grow. However, for now, those limits remain much tighter. In the near term, we already know that a well-selected crew can live together on the ISS for extended periods. Depending on the number of astronauts aboard, the available space per person ranges from as little as 50 cubic meters to as much as 130 cubic meters. On a trip to Mars, it's reasonable to assume that providing extra space would be a priority to help maintain sanity. Additionally, while food and water will be packed, having some green space for growing fresh vegetables would offer multiple benefits, including recycling carbon dioxide, purifying air, and cleaning water. Even a crew of 6 likely needs only around 1,000 cubic meters of living space, which is the equivalent to a 10 by 10 by 10 meter cube, or about 33 feet per side. However, not all parts of the ship need to be under gravity. Instead, let's consider a setup with 2 crew modules, one for men and one for women. From a practical standpoint, astronauts are typically married to people not on the mission. While science fiction often envisions married couples on space journeys, this is not a preferred approach in current mission planning. See Robert Heinlein's classic novel, A Stranger in a Strange Land, for some of the reasoning for and against. For now, let's use the idea of 2 modules as a convenient way to divide living spaces. These modules should be designed so that all the crew members could fit into one if there is a problem or temporary shutdown for maintenance. Rather than a simple 10-meter wide cube, we will imagine hammerhead-shaped modules, each 10 meters long, 5 meters wide, and 5 meters deep, or about 32 by 16 by 16 feet, excluding exterior walls. These modules could be split into 2 levels. The lower level might house small bedrooms for each crew member, a bathroom with normal plumbing, and storage. The upper level could be a shared common space with a gym, kitchenette, laundry facilities, and hydroponic equipment. You might have shared facilities between the two modules, but having backups is always useful. Plus, you could take one set down to the planet while leaving the other for the crew that remained on board. While it's good for the crew to eat together, they could alternate meals between the two modules, and the non-rotating main section of the ship is easily accessible as well. Each hammerhead module might be connected to the ship by 6 tethers, arranged in a hexagon, which could also support a pressurized sleeve around it. This sleeve could even be illuminated and used for growing vining plants. It probably wouldn't be wide enough for a staircase, but could include a ladder and an electric winch or pulley system to move people or cargo with less effort. For a mission like this, the tether or shaft length likely doesn't need to exceed 20 to 30 meters. This setup would result in a rotation rate around 5 to 6 RPM to give you something between 0.5 to 1 full G, which should be tolerable for most crew members, especially with pre-screening for motion sickness and a supply of Dramamine on hand. Full gravity might not be desirable in all cases, too. You may want to accommodate them to lower gravity than Earth's while en route to Mars, and might begin at full gravity and lower it towards Martian levels during the long trip, and the reverse on the way home to get them used to full gravity again. This also scales up well if you want bigger modules for a bigger crew of a dozen or more, which I tend to favor over a skeleton crew approach given mission durations. Needless to say, it would help if we could experiment on a space station in orbit of Earth first, to see what minimum radius was needed, though we can always go for a simple tether arrangement and a much greater length if lower RPM is needed. The additional structure required for a hammer habitat shaft is not trivial, especially if we're aiming for something like an elevator shaft or a spiral staircase. If you need that longer length, you might make a ship with a habitat section and a cargo section that just slipped apart into a bolo hab for the mission, to avoid needing to move between modules much. On the other hand, a spaceship planning to spend several years traveling to and from Mars, possibly orbiting it for an extended period, providing both artificial gravity and an easy way to move between modules would be highly beneficial. Hammer habitats could also prove very valuable in low-gravity environments like Mars or the Moon. By combining spin gravity with local gravity, you could tilt the floor inside the module diagonally. The lower the local gravity, the more the floor tilts toward the vertical and vice versa. Entire habitats could be designed at this angle, spinning to create artificial gravity. These configurations, often referred to as bull habs or rotohabs, tend to be deeper than they are wide. We don't yet know how much gravity people on Mars or the Moon will need to remain healthy. It is possible that the minimal gravity of these bodies is sufficient, which would make building rotating habitat sections on spaceships much simpler. However, if it turns out that additional gravity is necessary, the hammer habitat approach is a practical solution. For instance, you could build a tower on a low-gravity body and swing modules around it, or even land a spaceship equipped with pre-existing hammer habitats. In low-gravity environments, a tethered swing from a tower would not trace a perfectly circular path, but instead follow a shape resembling an umbrella. This would require a taller tower. Alternatively, you could keep that path flat and use a more robust central shaft for the module to rotate around. It wouldn't take too much power to keep that spin going, even in the thin Martian atmosphere, but the more radius you needed or lower RPM, the faster that habitation module is spinning, and the frictional losses will rise sharply. But it should be quite viable at the same scale we were discussing for the ship traveling there a moment ago. Where the gravity is the same as Mars but there's no atmosphere to cause drag, you might construct a large umbrella-like structure over your base to collect solar power and reflect excess sunlight. Around its edges, you could run a hammer habitat to provide full gravity for the crew, allowing them to spend most of their time there while mining or farming is conducted in the lower gravity of the central base. Fundamentally, where gravity is needed but population or infrastructure requirements are low, the tethered habitat or hammer habitat approach will likely be the easiest and most practical solution. For quite some time, these designs are likely to remain the primary way we generate spin gravity for crews in space. Later, as our presence in space grows, we can build larger ring habitats and cylinders. However, even then, it's likely there will still be far more tethered and hammer habitats than rings or cylinders. While the latter might house larger populations and provide significantly more total land area, they represent a major investment in resources and construction. They won't be necessary until we have far more people living and working in space. This is where hammer habitats play a crucial role as the first step toward a future filled with larger megastructures.
Rungworlds. After hammer habitats, we can move back up in scale again, because a rungworld is almost the opposite design philosophy and yet also very similar. A hammer habitat is the minimum you need to get spin gravity for a crew, a pair of modules or a small rotating arm doing the job cheaply. A rungworld is what happens when you've been building O'Neill cylinders for centuries, and someone looks at a cluster of them and says, "Hey, what if we connect all these into one enormous structure?" The name is Rungworld, rung as in the rung of a ladder, not ringworld, and in many ways it is a hammer habitat where you just add more and more modules to a big circle. Only here the circle, while enormous, is not a source of tensile strain, unlike the Niven ringworld. The basic idea is that you place many rotating habitats in parallel, like rungs of a ladder, and connect their end caps to long, thinner habitats or transit corridors running along the sides. Those side structures might themselves be Topopolis-like cylinders, or they might be mostly non-rotating infrastructure: rail lines, power systems, mirrors, radiators, storage, industrial docks, and shielded transit tubes. The result is not a single giant cylinder or ring, but a repeating pattern of cylinders tied together into one semi-continuous artificial geography. The easiest version to imagine uses standard Island 3 O'Neill cylinders as rungs. Each one is about 4 kilometers in radius and 32 kilometers long, about 800 square kilometers of interior surface for a single cylinder, or about 1,300 square kilometers for a paired version made out inside, about 500 square miles. Now line those up side by side, with their end caps connected to 2 long axial corridors, and each new rung adds another county-sized world to the structure. 10 rungs is a small nation, 100 rungs is a major country, 1,000 rungs is continent-class territory, but built out of modules that are individually familiar and far less exotic than bishop rings or McKendree cylinders. That modularity is the main point. A bishop ring or McKendree cylinder asks you to build one vast thing. A rungworld lets you grow by addition. Build one cylinder, then another, then connect them with transit and utility spines. If population grows, add more rings. If one cylinder needs repair, quarantine, political independence, or ecological redesign, it can be isolated or even removed without endangering the entire structure. That makes it more like a city growing block by block, or a nation adding towns along a railway, rather than a single all-or-nothing mega project. Now, these can be wrapped around a small moon or asteroid or even a large gas giant planet, but I typically imagine them as vast rings around the sun, and like the Topopolis, or a road, they have no meaningful maximum size. You could fit millions of rungs on one ring around the sun. This arrangement also solves some problems that standalone cylinders have. O'Neill cylinders are often paired for counter-rotation and stability, or shrunk down dimension like with the Lewis 1 or Kalpana variations. But once you have dozens or hundreds of them, you can balance angular momentum across the entire structure. Some cylinders spin one way, some spin the other, and the side spines carry mechanical, electrical, and transport connections between them. You can even group them by climate or purpose: residential cylinders, agricultural cylinders, ocean cylinders, forest preserves, industrial cylinders, low-gravity recreation spaces, and heavily shielded civic centers. Travel inside a rungworld would be very different from travel inside a planet. Moving around one cylinder is local traffic. Moving cylinder to cylinder means going through the end cap, entering the side spine, taking a train, elevator, or maglev capsule to the next rung. If the rungs are spaced a few kilometers apart, nearby communities are almost suburban. If spaced hundreds of kilometers apart, each cylinder is more like a city-state or province along a vast artificial railroad. With vacuum trains inside the side spines, even very large rungworlds could remain socially connected, at least until light lag starts becoming noticeable. The ecological possibilities are interesting too. A single O'Neill cylinder can support a rich environment, but is still a limited one. A rungworld can make ecology distributed. Birds or pollinators might travel through controlled corridor habitats. Fish could move through waterlocks or canal cylinders. Large animals might be moved between habitats for migration, breeding, or managed range. You probably would not let every species wander freely through the whole system, because that is how you invent the most expensive, invasive species problem in history. But the options exist to make the whole thing more biologically connected than a simple cluster of sealed stations. A rungworld also makes sense for interstellar arcs and Gardner ships. Instead of sending one giant habitat to another star, you send a connected civilization of habitats, each its own arc ship cylinder hab with an engine, but able to detach, add new modules, repair damaged sections, and even leave behind daughter colonies and systems along the way. The structure is both ship and settlement, not a metal cave where descendants wait for arrival, but a mobile archipelago of worlds. To me, its true epic value is that we can do the same trick with them that we can with Niven Ringworlds, without impossibly strong materials. You can wrap one around a star, then another at slightly different angle and radius, then another, rinse and repeat till you achieve Dyson sphere-like enclosure. It is an interesting example of space habitat conglomeration, and in this version, many Rungworlds surrounding a star become a conglomeration of space habitat conglomerations. But it is also just one example of these sorts of conglomerations of habitats and megaclusters. Let us wrap up our anthology by discussing some more. What happens when we start merging and combining in many different types of facilities to create true meganations in space? We imagine cities among the stars. What we will build are constellations of worlds. Humanity may one day build 1 billion new worlds, not by terraforming alien planets, but by assembling them, piece by piece, in the void. But just like we rarely build a single house without a road, a neighbor, or a community, our space habitats may not be solitary wanderers. They may be parts of greater wholes, living clusters, orbital tapestries, civilizations among the stars, not scattered but woven together. Today, to celebrate the 11th anniversary of our very first episode, Megastructures in Science and Science Fiction, we will explore the future of space habitat clusters and conglomerations, from simple daisy chains of O'Neill cylinders to vast modular megastructures bristling with life and purpose. We will look at why these habitats come together, how they share energy, culture, and security, and what strange new shapes our homes among the stars might take. Because when you have the power to build worlds, the next question becomes, how do you connect them? Why clustered habitats? When most people imagine a space habitat, they picture a lone cylinder or a torus drifting serenely through the void, like a futuristic Noah's Ark set against a backdrop of stars. But just a single house doesn't make a city, or even a village. Most space habitats won't be lonely pioneers orbiting in isolation. They'll come in clusters, networks, and constellations, sprawling living archipelagos in the sea of space. And there are good reasons for that. First, there's logistical efficiency. Space habitats are likely to need routine shipments of materials, whether it's raw carbon from a nearby asteroid, replacement parts from a fab station, or any number of specialized items that can be created more efficiently in a dedicated factory or farm somewhere than by a local 3D printer. Grouping habitats allows shared infrastructure, dedicated freight lines, tethered maglev tracks, or even shared solar beam arrays or communication relays. Energy can be harvested collectively and distributed on demand across the cluster, smoothing over surges and outages. Second, there's safety in numbers. Space is vast and hostile. A lone station might face dangers with only its onboard crew and resources, but a cluster can respond as a community, routing emergency services from one station to another, whether it's firefighting drones, replacement air tanks, or even mobile habitats doubling as rescue vessels. Third, communication and culture thrive in proximity. The speed of light may be fast, but even a 1-second delay becomes noticeable in conversation, and unbearable for anything truly collaborative. A densely packed cluster of habitats, all within a few 100,000 kilometers, can share not just media and messages, but cultural events, marketplaces, even public services. Think of them not as floating towns, but as orbital cities, or counties, or even nations. And finally, there is gravitational practicality. Keeping stations near one another helps stabilize their orbits, especially around shared points like Lagrange zones, planetary rings, or artificial masses like tethered asteroids. Their proximity allows them to piggyback on common orbital mechanics or shared anchor structures, making station keeping far less energy intensive. A tether connecting two stations, each just one side of a stable Lagrange point, can tug on each other to keep stable, where by themselves they are not quite stable, and doing so widen the useful size of such rare and useful locations. Indeed, as we explored a couple weeks back in our orbital ecologies episode, the very nature of both humans and space habitats is, the former wanting wider community connections, while the latter tends to be more practical when smaller, and tends to favor this sort of tether-connected conglomeration. It's no coincidence that I opened that episode with a narrative vignette from the perspective of a conductor on an interhabitat tether train. In short, the lonely satellite is a transitional phase, the futuralizing community, clusters of worlds forged not by continental drift or tectonic upheaval, but by design, cooperation, and imagination. A galactic suburbia, or perhaps a galactic Venice, connected by cable instead of canal, and humming with life. And we must be mindful of just how empty space remains, even in a fully built Dyson swarm. Even if we had the raw materials to entirely englobe a star in space habitats, they would likely orbit in a broad band at least 5% closer or farther from Earth's distance from the Sun, a shell about 10 million miles wide. It would take roughly a quadrillion O'Neill cylinders to achieve such an englobement, and they were evenly distributed throughout this roughly 4 trillion cubic kilometer shell. The average distance between each station would be about 1,600 kilometers, or 1,000 miles. That's a lot of elbow room for a community of perhaps 1 million, and while tethering several habitats together would increase that spacing elsewhere, it would often make far more sense to have neighboring stations just a few cylinder lengths apart, close enough to easily share power and communication, or even water and air via pipes, to a reserve or recycling hub in emergencies. Nor would every habitat be an O'Neill cylinder, any more than every city is a metropolis. We expect habitats of many shapes, sizes, and purposes, from nature preserves to suburbs and urban centers, as well as numerous ancillary facilities, factories, docks, shipyards, and sprawling solar collectors, thinner than paper but larger than all the habitats combined. Farms, too, often built along similar lines but with simpler or more cost-effective construction. Habitat types and roles within clusters. Not every space habitat will look like the classic O'Neill cylinder, long, gleaming, and forested within. Just as cities contain neighborhoods, districts, parks, factories, and farms, habitat clusters will be a mosaic of diverse structures, each serving its own role in a larger whole. The image of identical spinning cylinders orbiting side by side might make for clean geometry, but reality will favor functional variety. You will have residential cores, sprawling habitats tailored for human comfort and daily life. These might resemble garden suburbs under domed skies or glittering vertical ecopolises that blend art and automation. Some will spin for artificial gravity, others might float weightless, home to those who prefer or are adapted to zero-G living. Some will split the difference to be low gravity, some will be compact single-family habitats, others vast arcologies housing millions. Then there are utility habitats, space factories, power plants, dry docks, and data centers, structures that don't need parks or schools, just raw function. Some might run on sunlight beamed from kilometers away, or tap fusion or black hole generators. Others may operate autonomously, with only a handful of human technicians or robots. Entire clusters might include habitats optimized for growing crops under alien conditions, agricultural rings with perfectly tuned light and humidity for every row of hydroponic plants. These space farms can be built lean and efficient, stripped down to the necessities, and connected via tethers to the more luxurious living habitats. Wildlife will have its place too, not just pets and pollinators, but whole nature preserves floating among the stars. These range from microhabitats preserving a single endangered species to grand sanctuaries like New Geauga 6 BC, designed to replicate the landscape of Ice Age Ohio in exhaustive detail. Other habitats like the Great Congo McKendree Cylinder might span thousands of square kilometers, supporting entire ecosystems and megafauna once on the brink of extinction. Some preserves even house resurrected species, like the mammoths and saber-tooths of Siberia Park, their icy world fed by tethered space farms trucking fodder and nutrients. Habitats will be cultural canvases too. Just as neighborhoods differ in architectural style and rhythm of life, habitats might emulate historical eras, alien aesthetics, or entirely novel cultural movements, from Victorian-themed stations to Edo-period Japanese cylinders, from classic utopias to cyberpunk metropolises suspended beneath aurora-lit ceilings. Each habitat can express an idealized vision of life, history, or even fantasy. Some will be open to tourists, others strict intentional communities where residents sign lifestyle contracts more demanding than any HOA could imagine. Nor are these clusters entirely sealed. Many will include hybrid transit habitats, floating ports for interstellar travelers, or mobile habitats that drift between stations. Some of these mobile units may plug into larger structures, orbital cul-de-sacs where nomadic vessels can dock, expand, and refuel. Others might be long-haul caravans, transporting goods and cultures between the stars. Together, these diverse structures form more than a cluster. They form a living organism, a symphony of engineering and ecology, shaped by the needs, dreams, and experiments of countless cultures, each habitat a world, and each cluster a civilization in miniature. Mobility and modularity, the politics of movable worlds. And here's the awesome part. These habitats are not static. They can dock and undock, merge and part ways. A sprawling conglomeration might look like a three-dimensional mesh, dense and glittering like a web of stars, with solar panels arrayed on the sunward side and vast heat radiators stretched out into the dark. Together they form not merely an archipelago, but a nation in space, a true constellation of civilization. But unlike nations on Earth, locked in the unyielding geography of mountains, rivers, and oceans, these orbital nations float free. A new habitat can join the cluster, bringing its people and culture with it, or it can leave, peacefully detaching and charting a course toward a new star or quieter orbit. No armies mustered, no borders bled for. This freedom of motion is transformative. On Earth, land is fixed and scarce, and that scarcity often fuels conflict. When neighbors clash, there's no way to simply pick up and move your farmland, your factories, your family graves. If you have a farm or a yard, you must convince your neighbors to sell it if you want to expand them. Political, cultural, and religious tensions fester in place because the place itself cannot change. In space, property is portable. When the ground beneath you is not fixed, disputes take different forms. A discontented habitat does not need to declare war to find freedom. It can disconnect from the local power grid and commerce lanes, thank its neighbors for their hospitality, and quietly thrust away, becoming the seat of a new cluster, a splinter community setting sail into the stars with fresh vision. Others may follow, some may one day return. In space, migration and succession are not upheavals, they are a natural part of the orbital life cycle. They are a natural part of the orbital life cycle in a free society. Even when two space nations don't get along, they don't have to share a border, they can simply change their relative positions. And if they happen to share a static orbital path, such as the same ring or ellipse, most conglomerations will only intersect once or twice a year, passing near each other briefly before continuing on their very different routes. These meetings are opportunities, not for conflict, but for exchange, a time to trade, to visit, to celebrate shared roots, or to move. An individual, a family, or even a whole community might decide to drift to a new home, one better aligned with their values or vision. Indeed, they might buy commercial advertisements on each other to encourage tourism or migration. This fluidity encourages tolerance. When departure is an option, coercion becomes less necessary. Diversity becomes less threatening when every culture can quite literally carve out its own space, its own habitat, orbiting beside others or far apart as it chooses. It also creates a pressure valve for innovation. In any large society, progress can stall under the weight of consensus. But in a modular civilization, a radical idea doesn't have to wait for widespread approval. It can be tested in its own habitat, and if it thrives, others may copy it. A future renaissance might begin not in a hidden corner of Florence, but in a single habitat that dared to dream different and floated just far enough from the mainstream to give its ideas room to grow. Even diplomacy changes when nations are not bound to borders but connected by choice. Treaties aren't about fixed lines on a map, but mutual agreements to stay connected, agreements that can be revised, renewed, or respectfully rejected without bloodshed. In the cosmic future, power may not come from controlling land, but from attracting habitats, from offering something worth orbiting beside, and that, at its heart, is the true promise of space habitats that we've been exploring on the show for the past 11 years, and that visionaries like Gerard K. O'Neill and organizations like the National Space Society, which I've had the honor of leading these past few years as president, have been championing for over half a century. It's not simply more land for humanity, but a better chance at a peaceful coexistence on it. A civilization tethered together by shared bonds of friendship and cooperation, not coercion or desperation. tethers, transit, and shared infrastructure. In the vacuum of space, roads as we know them do not exist, but connections still matter. Space habitat clusters may float freely, but they will not be adrift. They will be tethered, physically, economically, energetically, and those tethers will form the backbone of civilization in orbit. Physical tethers might begin as simple umbilicals, power cables, water lines, or rail tracks between two nearby stations, but scale them up and you get megastructural marvels. Maglev lines stretched across kilometers of emptiness, supporting cargo pods or even passenger trains moving silently from one worldlet to another. Tubular vacuum trains running on solar power and gyroscopic stabilization might crisscross a cluster the way subways do beneath Earth's cities. Tethers can also provide orbital stabilization. Two habitats connected by a cable and carefully balanced across the Lagrange point or orbital ring can pull each other into greater stability, extending the practical lifespan of their orbits and making them resistant to minor perturbations. Think of them like space's version of flying buttresses, architectural solutions scaled up to orbital mechanics, and this may be scaled up to include not two habitats tethered together, but 2,000. Beyond cables, shared infrastructure will likely be everywhere. Massive solar arrays, thin as gossamer, might drift above a cluster, beaming power wirelessly to habitats below using lasers or microwaves, or even superconducting cables. These energy platforms could stretch for thousands of square kilometers, larger than the habitats they support, and reposition themselves to chase the sun or align with fusion relays. Waste recycling and resource reprocessing might also be centralized, especially for smaller Habs aimed at families. Rather than each habitat developing its own closed-loop systems, clusters could share dedicated waste hubs, automated habitats where matter is sorted, sterilized, recycled, and remanufactured. From these nodes, purified air and water might flow back along the same pipes that export fertilizer and waste heat. Transit between habitats won't be just for goods either. People will move, too, on tethers, in shuttles, or in personal space pods, not much more complicated than a modern car. Larger clusters may include public transit systems, with schedules and terminals like an orbital bus depot, but for those who can afford them, spacecraft homes, personal vessels with docking permissions, could allow nomadic lifestyles even within a relatively fixed community. And it isn't just about material transit. Shared data networks, virtual wars, and interlinked simulations will stitch these clusters together as much as physical tethers do. Within milliseconds, inhabitants can move between digital campuses, theaters, or meeting rooms, even if the real-world habitats housing them are kilometers apart. These digital infrastructures might be run by decentralized AIs or mutual interest cooperatives, and access to them might define membership to a cluster as much as physical location does. And just as roads gave rise to roadside inns, stores, and gas stations, space tetherways might host refueling nodes, repair drones, or even little rotating rest stops for passing craft. We can picture a civilization that isn't just defined by its habitats, but by its links, by the pathways of trade, trust, and travel that hold its worlds together. In space, it's not enough to build a world, you need to wire it in. Shapes of clusters and dynamic conglomerations. So if space habitat clusters are free to grow, shrink, rearrange, or even migrate, what do they actually look like? Well, that depends. In a word, everything. Some might resemble a daisy chain, a series of Onio cylinders connected end to end, spinning in tandem, linked by magnetic tethers or structural bridges. These could be aligned like pearls on a string, or arranged with deliberate curvature, forming vast loops, spirals, or even orbital rings around a planet, moon, or artificial anchor. Each could be its own neighborhood, theme park, research outpost, or farming commune. If one habitat needs repairs or a cultural reset, it can be undocked and replaced like a train car or a modular servo blade. Others might adopt a honeycomb or cellular pattern, a tight hexagonal lattice where each habitat is surrounded by neighbors on all sides, exchanging power, goods, and people across high-speed transit tubes. These are the dense humming metropolises of orbital civilization, and between their nodes we might find shared parks, communal greenhouses, or zero-G recreation zones, free-floating arcades and atriums drifting in the void, used by all. Then there are net-shaped superstructures, thousands of habitats connected by cable in loose three-dimensional meshes that can flex and shift like scaffolding or tendrils. These might be wrapped around massive utility hubs, fusion plants, manufacturing forges, or gravitational anchors like mined-out asteroids. Their interstitial space can be filled with solar arrays, massive farms, or thermal radiators. They can look chaotic at first glance, but a closer look reveals hidden geometry, logic, and purpose, like a coral reef grown from human intention. Some clusters may be built as stars themselves, spheres of habitats arranged around a central energy core, like a miniature Dyson swarm inside a single superstructure. These megastructures, possibly built deep in space and far from stars, would have internal weather systems, shared lighting controls, and even manage day-night cycles for each face of the cluster, giving residents the illusion of sun and sky. Others might not float freely in space, but instead be carved into rock or ice. Large asteroids or comets hollowed out in vast networks of chambers and tunnels. These immense bodies provide not only the raw materials to fuel their local economies, but also natural protection from radiation, micrometeors, and even detection, ideal for those seeking concealment or defense. For similar reasons, some habitats might encase themselves in solid shells, ranging from thin layers no thicker than tinfoil or solar panels to massive barriers as tough as battleship armor. These outer superstructures help contain drifting debris, which, while moving slow relative to the habitat, could become deadly when intercepting another trajectory at high speed. Such shells might be layered, thin-walled balloons filled with shielding materials like water, ice, or hydrogen, which are not only abundant and affordable, but also highly effective at absorbing radiation. The outermost surface could be lined with solar panels on the sunward side and heat radiators on the dark side, interspersed with access points and communication arrays. And still others might go full arcology, solid megahabitats kilometers thick, layered like giant beehives, with whole ecosystems stacked vertically. Picture an O'Neill cylinder not as a single living space, but as a layer stacked on them like floors in a skyscraper, sharing spin and power, each with its own biome or climate. But perhaps the most important feature of these clusters is that they are not fixed. In the way that a medieval city evolved organically, walls added, suburbs growing, castles rebuilt, so too would space habitat conglomerations shift over time. A science cluster might gradually attract related industries and institutions until it becomes a sprawling mega-university arcology. Others may evolve into cultural mosaics, as habitats inspired by specific aesthetics or historical periods gather in themed microclusters, whether emulating ancient Japan, the Roman Empire, or entirely fictional realms. Some might be deliberate homages to the past, others playful reinterpretations, fusing nostalgia with futurism in stylized forms that reflect both tradition and taste. A region struck by a solar flare or micrometeor storm might temporarily fragment and relocate to safer orbits. A cluster afflicted by catastrophe, external attack, or internal strife might dissolve temporarily, its habitats dispersing to neighboring conglomerations. Instead of emergency workers and supplies rushing into a disaster zone, as we do today, the afflicted population itself might move, spreading the impact across systems better equipped to help. Relief isn't just deployed to the crisis is redistributed to the relief infrastructure, ensuring no single area becomes overwhelmed. This dynamic structure allows for growth and adaptation. It also makes these orbital societies more resistant to stagnation. You don't just move away when things get bad, you shift orbit, add a new habitat, rearrange the cluster structure. It's not unlike urban planning. If your downtown gets too crowded, you can literally build more cities, or send part of it to a new orbit altogether. You don't have to invoke eminent domain to slice some farmer's land in half for a freeway, you just move it over. And if that farmer wants to expand, they can just add on. It is possible to extend a cylinder or ring habitat, or simply add another smaller one nearby. Even more exotic shapes are possible if we go beyond spin gravity and adopt clock tech, technologies that allow artificial gravity, massive force fields, or even distributed habitats using inertial dampeners or field suspension. In those cases, the only real limit is imagination and energy budget. But even with just known physics, the shape of the future's living spaces will be wild, beautiful, and ever-changing. Not rigid castles in space, but blooming cities of light. Digital ecosystems and cultural identity. In space, your address may orbit the sun, but your true neighborhood might exist in the clouds. As habitats link into vast data networks, a parallel civilization will flourish in cyberspace, unbounded by gravity, atmosphere, or radiation shielding. Entire digital cities may emerge, layered atop their physical counterparts, offering shared virtual spaces for work, leisure, education, and governance. These virtual layers become both extensions and expressions of identity. A habitat's cultural allegiance might lie more with its online polity than its physical neighbors, and visiting a neighboring cluster could feel less like crossing a border and more like logging into another planet's forum. Yet because of light speed delays, most of a Dyson swarm will be hours apart by signal lag. In such a setting, clusters tied up to maintain real-time communication gain a distinct advantage, another compelling reason to form close-knit conglomerates in the void. Default sprawl-level neocylinders 1,000 miles apart, a light second of back-and-forth signal lag gives you a radius of about 90 habitats and about 3 million habitats in that value. That might sound like a lot, probably a few hundred billion people in fact, but even at this distance things are getting laggy, and even just spacing these habitats down to 20 miles apart, which leaves everything still mostly empty space, will let you increase your habitat density by a factor of 125,000, potentially allowing many quadrillions to live inside a conglomeration close enough to speak comfortably and zoom each other real time. Economics and trade in habitat constellations. Economics in space won't just be about scarcity, it'll be about coordination. Clusters can share labor, resources, and expertise, forming cooperative economies on a galactic scale. A single cluster might house habitats that specialize in biotech, zero-gravity manufacturing, or digital artistry, each exporting their goods or services via physical shipping or data transmission. You might send refined metals by rail tether, but also license virtual fashion lines or AI-tended garden designs across the solar system. Some habitats might run entirely on reputation or credit within a community trust network. Others could operate as charter cities with their own currencies, legal codes, and tax systems. Trade isn't just physical, it's cultural, legal, and mimetic, spreading norms and novelties across the stars. And in such an environment, the richest habitat might not be the biggest or brightest, but the one that attracts the most collaboration. Let us keep in mind that a few thousand habitats can easily share combined services, like a Supreme Court or a College of Medicine with specialists in thousands of disciplines, if they're part of a single conglomeration. Spread too far apart, though, and communication slows to a crawl. It becomes an email and message board environment, not one where real-time conversations or live collaborations are practical. In contrast, travel within a tightly clustered conglomeration is fast and affordable. You just hopping on a train or piloting your own personal spaceship across a few dozen kilometers of open space. Education and intergenerational planning. Clusters also enable unique opportunities for education and long-term planning. A habitat doesn't just raise children, it raises civilizations. Entire learning habitats might exist where students rotate through different cluster modules to learn agriculture, engineering, politics, or art from people who live them. Some clusters may even practice long-range social planning, where habitats are built with the expectation that they'll split off after a few generations to form new branches, like educational seed pods, that eventually blossom into full cultural entities. Then they attach an engine to that space habitat and fire it off into the interstellar void. Indeed, whole clusters of space habitats could strap on engines. Spaceships moving in interstellar space together view each other all as in a relative stop and can connect by tethers too. The moving space outside is basically just a perpetual galactic wind, which is already the case in space anyway. But back to schools. Because many orbital societies will also enjoy longer lifespans thanks to biotech, automation, and medical advances, education won't be front-loaded in youth. Lifelong learning may be the norm, and clusters will offer not just schools, but continual reinvention. People can start families later too if they wish. They're not trying to outrun a biological clock or get their career rolling strongly so they can fit one in before retirement age. Security and conflict management. Of course, any civilization, however ideal, must wrestle with questions of conflict and safety. Habitat clusters might employ rotating civic defense duties, sharing emergency response and peacekeeping roles across the collective. Others may follow mutual defense pacts like orbital versions of NATO. Some might adopt non-violence as a principle, relying on physical distance and transparency to deter hostility. Others might share defense contracts with megastates. And just as city-states once hired third-party mediators or mercenary forces, some clusters may delegate security to neutral AI-administered defense networks. ensuring that no single node accumulates too much military power. The key is that violence becomes less efficient than movement. Why conquer a neighbor if they can simply drift away, taking their value and their warning stories with them? A Tale of Unity. I'd originally intended this episode to continue our 2025 narrative theme, picking up where life in 2525 AD and orbital ecologies left off, with another Canterbury Tales-inspired vignette, The Commissioner's Tale. The idea was to explore how space habitat conglomerations might evolve politically, not into sovereign empires, but into something more familiar, states composed of counties and districts. Part of the inspiration came from back home here in Ohio, where counties serve as key administrative divisions and are typically run by a board of 3 or more commissioners. For those who didn't know, I've been very involved in local government since I left the US Army, which I enjoy, whereas I actively dislike federal and global politics. There aren't any physics or spaceships involved in townships, villages, or local elections, and I am still chairman of our board of elections. But the origins of this show go back to me missing the chance to talk about science and science fiction, and I've always had a fascination with different ways communities structure and organize themselves. The problem with writing the vignette was that one of my closest friends is one of those county commissioners, and I kept subconsciously writing him into the story, so much so that I finally scrapped the vignette altogether and decided to just talk about the concept directly. It is also an interesting aspect of local governments that you often have chunks of counties wanting to break off to be a new county, and regularly have a city or village annexing a bit of unincorporated township around them, and I think these might be better models for what happens in the future, and also presents a much wider example, especially in modern times, of how community mergers or divisions would take place. In a lot of science fiction, we see a small colony, maybe tens of thousands or even a few million people, declaring full independence and forming a completely sovereign nation, often standing toe-to-toe not with a typical country, but with an Earth-spanning superpower. You get all of Mars or all of the Moon breaking away from Earth entirely. I've always found that a bit dubious, especially when it comes to orbital colonies. After all, you're still right there at Earth, just a bit further up. At most, you're a new island or continent, not a new planet. In terms of scale, the comparison breaks down even further. Your average O'Neill cylinder, at the large end of typical space habitat designs, is more akin to a county than a country. A Stanford Torus, more like a township, and in Ohio those often default to 5 by 5 mile or 8 by 8 kilometer squares, so it seems far more plausible that some American-built colonies might not be angling for sovereignty at all, but for statehood, as part of a larger conglomeration of space counties forming a new state. Or maybe you've got a cluster of habitats in geostationary orbit over the equator, aligning with the North American West Coast. One might be founded by Californians, another by folks from Oregon, and another from British Columbia. Rather than forming a new nation, they might apply to become counties of their home states, or a regional district under Canadian provincial law, and some habitats might not even spiral to that level. Maybe one just wants to be a ward or district of Los Angeles or San Francisco, where they serve as an economic port at the top of a non-equatorial space elevator. Needless to say, that kind of civic integration seems a lot more grounded, literally and figuratively, than sudden declarations of planetary independence. Religion, ritual, and meaning. Spiritual life in space may flourish, not fade. With habitats able to isolate or interconnect as desired, religious communities can construct sacred environments far beyond what is feasible on Earth. You cannot take your tribal lands with you to space, but you can make new ones and migrate them if your neighbors start to eye them up. A cylinder might be an orbital monastery with seasons precisely attuned to ancient calendars, or a mighty temple or medieval cathedral scaled up to megastructural scale. These structures might serve not just the faithful, but tourists, scholars, and seekers from faraway orbits. One of our biggest issues with post-scarcity civilization is finding meaning and purpose, and while many might pursue secular approaches, for them and those on these many paths, space can offer a place to set up your promised lands. The long view, legacy, and civilization. The real power of space habitat clusters isn't just expansion, it's continuity. On Earth, civilizations rise and fall with access to land, water, and stability. In space, we decouple survival from geography. A failing habitat is not a dying empire, it's a node in need of a reboot or a new alignment. And as clusters persist and evolve, they become testaments to human adaptability. 100 generations from now, someone might walk through a habitat built in your era, their feet echoing down the same alloy halls, their voice calling out in a language that evolved from yours. That is the legacy we are building, a civilization unmoored from the crust of planets, but anchored in human will. Space habitats are one of those topics that can look simple from a distance and then become wonderfully absurd the closer you get. At first, the idea is just put people in a spinning can. Then you remember that can needs not just gravity, but shielding, air, water, soil, light, heat rejection, farms, factories, docking ports, emergency shelters, parks, schools, hospitals, government offices, sewage treatment, recycling, industry, culture, and probably at least one committee arguing about whether the parkland to parking ratio is being handled properly. And yet for all of that complexity, the basic premise remains astonishingly simple. Planets are places we inherit. Space habitats are places we make. That does not mean planets stop mattering. Earth will always matter, and Mars, the Moon, Venus, Titan, and countless other worlds may all have futures of their own. But if civilization spreads through space on truly large scales, I suspect most people will not want to live at the bottom of gravity wells. They will live in structures like the ones we discussed today. Cylinders, toruses, spheres, rings, rungs, clusters, and strange combinations of all of them. Built where the resources are, where the energy is, where the work is, and where the people living there want their homes to be. One of the reasons I wanted to make this anthology is that we have covered many of these habitats before, but often years apart and often at very different stages of the channel. Some older episodes on this subject, like Life on Board an O'Neill Cylinder and our episode on continent-sized rotating space habitats, still have ideas I quite like a lot, but they are from an earlier era of the show when my speech impediment was way worse and when our graphics and presentation were much more limited. So I did not want this episode to just be a playlist with the staples removed. I want it to be curated, cleaned up, reorganized, and expanded. That is important to me with these anthology episodes. They are fun to do, but they should not just be reruns in a trench coat. Instead, they are the perfect chance to include some shorter topics, as we did today, that for one reason or another wasn't able to be a full-length episode yet, and not just paste them all together pell-mell. In this case, that meant trimming out old sponsor segments, old channel business, repeated explanations, and then adding new material and new context. This episode has over an hour of new material in it, including sections on designs that we've never really given proper attention to before, and new bridges between older ideas that make the whole family of habitats easier to compare. And even after all that, this is still not every habitat concept worth discussing. We had to leave a lot out. Some older material was too dated for this anthology, some designs belong in a different category, and some are just weird enough they deserve to be grouped with their other fellow weirdos. So we will be coming back to this in a follow-up anthology focused on more extreme or speculative options, habitats that rely on impossible or clock-tech materials, bizarre geometries, strange motivations, or designs that are less what will we build first, and more what would a civilization with too much power, too much time, and maybe too little adult supervision decide to make. That is where ideas like donut worlds, cube worlds, and other improbable artificial worlds belong. Some are nearly impossible in known physics, some are merely impractical, and some are impractical in ways that make them very fun to discuss. For today, though, we have stayed mostly with designs that belong somewhere on the plausible ladder, from early rotating stations and hammer habitats up through toruses, spheres, and O'Neill cylinders, then onward to bishop rings, McKendree cylinders, Topopolises, Rungworlds, and the great conglomerations of habitats that might one day form true cities, nations, and mega-civilizations of space. And that, I think, is the real takeaway. Space habitats are not just a workaround for the difficulty of terraforming planets. They are their own path. They let us separate land from geology, gravity from planetary mass, climate from accident, and political geography from fixed borders on a single surface. They turn world from something nature provides into something civilization can design, revise, copy, connect, move, or rebuild. That does not make them utopias. Every habitat we discuss today would have risks, costs, trade-offs, maintenance burdens, and failure modes. A bad government in a space habitat is still bad. A poor design is still dangerous. A neglected ecosystem is still fragile. But a future of habitats is also a future where the number of homes, landscapes, and experiments in civilization is not limited to a handful of habitable planets nature happened to leave lying around, and in my opinion, it represents a much bigger and brighter future for humanity. So, as always, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Which of these habitats would you actually want to live in? Which one deserves its own full episode? Which one do you think is most likely to be common, and which one is just too wild to ignore? And if you made it this far, around 4 hours in, thanks for watching, and have a great week.